The cold had already set in long before the child died, a creeping frost that didn't just claim lives, but cradled them. 40,000 years ago, in the wind-bitten steppes of what is now Siberia, a small human body was laid into the earth. She was no more than 2 or 3 years old, skin still soft, eyelashes intact. Her people would have wept, then walked away, leaving her to sleep beneath a silence that would last longer than memory. And yet, the cold did not forget. It preserved her breathless form with astonishing care, as if time itself had paused to listen. Today, she emerges again, not as a skeleton or a shadow, but as a frozen witness to an Ice Age life. Through her tissues, teeth and hair, we can now read stories once thought irretrievable, of seasons, struggles and family. This is the story of the humans who were frozen alive, and what their preserved bodies now whisper across the gap of deep time. This is Midnight Sapien, calm storytelling for curious minds. If you're feeling connected to this journey, just below the video there's a button that says subscribe. You can tap it now and unsubscribe anytime. The bell icon next to it will gently let you know when new stories arrive. Subscribing helps this channel continue making new videos. Without it, we simply can't keep going. If these stories bring you calm, you can tap the super thanks under this video. It truly helps keep these prehistoric journeys alive. By the way, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? If you feel like sharing that in the comments, it's a small reminder that we're all listening together, across time zones and continents, and if you drift off to sleep during this story, that's okay. You'll find timestamps and chapters down below in the description. Now, we begin with a frozen breath beneath the soil. It began with a face, small, rounded, still, pressed gently against the wall of ice like it had simply gone to sleep and never woken up. Not a skull, not a cast of bone or a fossil, but the preserved face of a human child, her skin a pale ochre against the blue-grey of the permafrost, her eyelashes intact, her lips sealed not by trauma but by time. Her body had been held in place for over 40,000 years, cocooned in the frost beneath the tundra of northeastern Siberia. When the excavation team arrived, it was not to dig for treasure or glory, but to listen. Because the ice does not shout, it does not roar. It murmurs, whispers, suggests. And when it offers up a body, whole, unspoiled, soft to the touch, it is less an announcement than an invitation. What kind of world could take a child like this and keep her safe for over 400 centuries? What force of nature is precise enough to preserve flesh and fragile strands of hair, yet vast enough to grind mountains into dust? The team moved carefully, tools barely scratching at the frozen sediment. Each centimetre removed risked disturbing the subtle balance that had held this body in its suspended cradle. She was found curled, knees drawn toward the chest, wrapped in the remnants of fur or perhaps grass. The textile too decayed to confirm. Yet her fingernails were visible, the arc of her ribs still smooth beneath the skin. Around her the soil was laced with pollen and insect wings, remnants of a summer long forgotten. In her stomach, plant fibres. In her mouth, particles of loess. Not only had her body been spared the collapse of time, but her last meal, the wind she breathed, the season she died, all of it had been recorded in exquisite accidental detail. She was not just an individual, she was an archive. And as they lifted her from the earth, the question emerged with weight and stillness. Is this discovery a gift or a haunting? What do we owe the dead when they no longer lie still, but stare back with closed eyes from under the frost? Scientists called in preservation teams and cryogenic specialists, rushing to stabilize her before modern air could begin the slow undoing of what the Ice Age had built. Layers of cold mist hissed across the chamber as the climate was controlled, and every measurement, humidity, pH, microbial balance, was monitored with reverence. Because this wasn't a dig. It was a conversation with the past, a forensic negotiation across millennia. One wrong move and her tissue might blacken, her skin might split. The memory encoded in her very being could dissolve into silence. What is the responsibility of those who wake the frozen? How do you hold the breath of a vanished world and not let it scatter into the heat? The presence of a body, whole and untouched, shatters the boundary between artifact and ancestor. Unlike a flint tool or a bead or a bone, this was someone. A child who once blinked and asked and dreamed. A life stopped, in motion. A moment suspended between two eternities. And in that stillness something begins to stir. Not in the child, but in those who gaze upon her. Not panic, not awe. Something more quiet. A kind of recognition. The contours of her face are unfamiliar, yet unmistakably human. Her brow is wide. Her jaw softer than expected. Her body smaller, likely no older than 3. But the proportions, the hands, the curve of the spine, all whisper the same story. We are of the same thread. What does it mean to look into the face of someone who lived before the dawn of agriculture, before cities, before metal, before writing, and feel a familial ache? What does it say about us that grief can stretch across 40,000 years? There is something unbearable about her silence, not because it threatens horror, but because it resists closure. She did not die in violence. There were no claw marks, no breaks in the bone, no mass grave, no ritual burial site, no narrative we can cling to with certainty. Instead, she simply appears, cradled in a layer of sediment between melting ice and shifting earth, her story hovering just out of reach. Could she have succumbed to the cold? To hunger? Did she wander too far from the safety of her group? Or did they place her here, gently, hoping the earth might keep what they could not? We do not know, and that perhaps is the most unsettling truth. That even with the miracle of preservation, time does not surrender meaning easily. For the researchers, there is both privilege and burden in this kind of discovery. Every sample taken from her skin, every scan of her organs, every sequencing of her DNA becomes an ethical frontier. Her body becomes a vessel of knowledge, a data set, but also a body. To dissect her is to learn. To disturb her is to desecrate. In museums and laboratories across the globe, debates rage quietly about how to treat remains like hers. Are they to be studied, revered, buried again? Who speaks for the dead when they have no name, no tribe, no descendants to claim them? And still, the questions deepen. Her teeth are worn in a way that suggests she was weaned early. The bone density in her legs suggests she was carried more than she walked. Microscopic analysis of the sediment surrounding her bones shows she was likely covered, at least partially, shortly after death. Perhaps by human hands, perhaps by wind and soil. The pollen in her mouth belongs to a species of flower no longer found in the region, which means it was warmer then. Which means she may have lived during a rare interglacial moment, a pause in the cold, a window of softness before the frost returned. What was that world like? What did it feel like to be alive when mammoths walked the plains and the sun shone dim through ash-laced clouds? How do you build a life inside an age of extinction? Because make no mistake, that is what the Ice Age was. Not simply a time of cold, but a time of endings. The great megafauna that had dominated the continents were beginning to disappear. Forests gave way to barren tundra. The wind carried ice and the scent of distance. For every surviving group of humans, the margin between life and death narrowed with each passing season. And yet, they endured. They hunted with spears tipped in stone, tracked reindeer and horse across miles of frozen plain, fashioned garments from hides, stitched together with sinew and patience. They told stories. They mourned. They prepared their dead. We know this not just from bones, but from ochre stains in caves, from carved figurines of mothers and animals, from the residue of fire and pigment. Survival was never just physical. It was imaginative. And this is what the frozen body reminds us of. Not just the reality of death, but the fullness of a life that came before it. In her limbs, the strength of a people who walked across continents. In her DNA, the echoes of migrations that linked Africa to Asia, Asia to Europe, across bridges of land now drowned by oceans. Her people were not isolated tribes, but nodes in a web of movement, exchange, and adaptation. She is proof of contact, of kinship, of motion. And yet, the irony is deep. Because she, who belonged to a lineage of wanderers, was stopped, perfectly still, and kept that way for over 400 centuries. When she was first found, Some researchers hesitated to release images to the public, not because of gore, but because of intimacy. There is something profoundly disquieting about seeing a face that does not belong to history books or reconstructions, but to itself, a real human, not imagined but visible, with cheeks, with closed eyes, with hands folded inward as if resting. We are not used to seeing the ancient so alive. The effect is not cinematic. It is deeply human. It breaks the illusion of detachment. It asks us to reconsider what it means to be modern, to be advanced, to be here. So much of archaeology functions as abstraction. We talk of populations, toolkits, cultural layers, climate pressures. But here, the abstraction falters. A child's body is not a statistic. It is not an indicator of population collapse or migration pressure. It is not a carbon date or a morphological trait. It is a child. And once we see her that way, the questions shift. Not what was the average life expectancy of her people, but did someone sing to her when she was born? Not how were their hunting patterns organised, but was she missed? Because when the dead return in flesh, we must confront them not as data, but as kin. What happens to science when the subject begins to feel like family? In the weeks following her excavation, samples were flown to laboratories across Europe and Asia. Tissue analysis revealed traces of malnutrition, suggesting a hard season before death. Her hair contained elevated levels of heavy metals, pointing to environmental exposure. Perhaps volcanic dust, perhaps dietary patterns we don't yet understand. A thin layer of silt inside her nasal cavity hinted at dust storms or burial in loose soil. Every clue opened a door, and behind every door, more silence. Because even as the data accumulated, the meaning remained elusive. Science could tell us what. But it struggled with why. Why here? Why now? Why her? And yet even ambiguity can be a revelation. In her we begin to glimpse the contours of an Ice Age childhood. One lived not in shadow or terror, but in motion. Perhaps she travelled with a band of families, their shelters mobile, their routines cyclical. Perhaps she knew the smell of mammoth dung, the warmth of firelight flickering on a cave wall, the songs her elders sang to the stars. Perhaps she died suddenly or slowly, alone or surrounded. We cannot know, but we can guess. And in the act of guessing, we begin to rebuild. Not just her life, but the world around it. Her discovery was not the first of its kind, nor will it be the last. In recent decades, the retreating permafrost has begun to surrender other bodies, adults, children, hunters, wanderers. Each emerges with different signs: pierced flesh, burial beads, feathered garments, traces of berries in the teeth. They arrive not as a parade of curiosities, but as reminders. The earth is warming, the ice is melting, and with every thaw a whisper rises from the mouths of the dead, from the memories of stone, from the pollen buried in ancient lungs. They are not being resurrected, they are being released, and the timing is no accident. What does it mean that these voices, frozen for tens of thousands of years, are returning now? Perhaps it means that time is not as linear as we pretend, that the past does not stay buried but waits, that we are not separate from these ancestors, but part of the same unfinished story. And as we receive their remains, cradled in foam and ice and sterile glass, we are also receiving a question, one they never spoke, but one we must now answer. Will we listen? For the viewer, you, listening now, this moment is not just observational, it is participatory. You're no longer merely watching a discovery unfold. You're standing at the edge of a world that once was. You're being handed a body that time tried to forget, and asked to consider what it still has to say. What knowledge survives inside a body when all the books are ash and all the myths are dust? What can flesh remember that language has lost? Quite a lot, it seems. In the tissue of her lungs, a residue of ancient air still lingers, its isotopic makeup offering hints of a climate barely known. In her teeth, the enamel lines reveal growth patterns, episodes of stress, perhaps seasons of hunger or recovery. In her gut, fragments of unprocessed plants speak of regional diets, seasonal behaviours, and the quiet brilliance of early human knowledge. All of it is uncoded slowly, meticulously, respectfully. But none of it replaces the truth that she cannot tell her own story. We must reconstruct it. And in doing so, we reveal as much about ourselves as we do about her. The impulse to preserve, to study, to understand, it is a noble one, but it is also, always, a reflection. Our questions about her are ultimately questions about us. Could we survive the world she lived in? Could we endure not just the cold, but the uncertainty, the loss, the silence? Or are we already vanishing in our own way, leaving behind only traces for some future people to unearth and misinterpret? Her preservation is both a miracle and a warning. She was not meant to be found. The earth did not design her as a message, but now that she is here, she becomes one. A message about fragility, about endurance, about the strange kindness of the cold, because without the frost, brutal, slow, unrelenting, she would be gone, lost like most of her kind. But the cold held her, not to protect perhaps, but to delay, to suspend the forgetting. And now that we have remembered her even briefly, she returns to the earth not alone, but known. In time, she may be reburied, or encased in a climate-controlled vault, or displayed, carefully, for the curious and the reverent. None of these outcomes are final, because history, real, human history, does not end in certainty. It ends in wonder, and sometimes, if we are lucky, in recognition. So we begin our journey here, not with triumph or discovery or answers, but with a whisper. The whisper of ice parting for breath. The whisper of skin meeting air for the first time in 40,000 years. The whisper of time loosening its grip just long enough to let one small face return. And what will we do with that face? Will we measure it, model it, archive it, or will we listen? Will we sit beside the frozen and hear not silence but continuity, not death, but memory? And if we do, what might we remember about them and about ourselves? Because in the end, the ice does not speak in certainty, it speaks in whispers, and the whisper is always the beginning. Because once we have seen the face of a child cradled by time, we cannot help but wonder, who were these people? Who stood under those ice age skies watching the same moon drift across the same dark, frost-bitten heavens? What hearts beat beneath furs and hides? What minds made meaning out of wind, blood and fire? The preserved body is only a doorway. What lies beyond is the deeper mystery, a species very much like ours, but forged in a crucible of cold and scarcity. And if we listen carefully enough, we may hear the echo of their footsteps not fading into the distance, but coming toward us. It is easy to imagine the Ice Age as stillness, a world locked in glacial paralysis. But the truth is motion. Across the frozen steppe of Eurasia, hundreds of thousands of years ago, something extraordinary began to unfold. Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, were moving. Not all at once, not as a single exodus, but in slow waves. Out of Africa, across deserts and rivers, threading their way through narrow corridors of climate and geography. Some travelled north, hugging the coasts. Others crossed mountain chains and settled into caves where the drip of mineral-laced water would later form curtains of stalactites over their fires. These were not nomads of chaos, but navigators of deep knowledge. They tracked stars. They mapped animal migrations in their minds. They knew which plants healed, which roots fed, which stones cracked clean. By the time the Ice Age reached its full, staggering breadth, Homo sapiens had already reached much of Eurasia. They did not come into an empty land. There were others here, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps others we have yet to name. The story of early humans in the Ice Age is not a conquest. It is a convergence, a weaving of lineages, a breath shared across different species of human, each adapting, surviving, vanishing, or mingling in turn. When we find the frozen, we are not just finding one species, we are finding the braided memory of many. Among the earliest preserved remains were not people, but animals. A baby mammoth, curled into itself, its trunk still pliable. A wolf, its teeth bared, frozen mid-snarl. These were found long before modern excavation methods existed. In the 19th century, Reports emerged of hunters in Siberia slicing meat from mammoth carcasses and feeding it to their dogs. The ground gave up what it had kept, but even then, even when seen as a resource or a curiosity, something deeper stirred. What does it mean that flesh can survive longer than story? And when the first frozen human was found, the tone changed. Suddenly, we were no longer looking at nature's creatures, but at ourselves, not just what we were, but what we still are. The turning point came with the discovery of Ötzi, high in the Alps, though he lived much later than the child in the permafrost. He was not from the Ice Age proper, but his presence reminded us that bodies can return across time. Then, the Siberian tundra answered with older voices, the Yana rhinoceros, the Berezovka mammoth, and then, finally, the children, the most haunting of all, found in the Kolyma region, in the shadows of melting earth, their skin still marked by ancient microbes, their hair still holding the scent of Ice Age pollen. These were not stories, these were people, frozen not in metaphor but in biology, not imagined but real. To see them is to collapse the distance between then and now. Their faces are not alien, their bones not primitive, their DNA, sequenced strand by a fragile strand, speaks in the same alphabet that builds your own. And within those genetic codes are echoes of interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovans, threads woven into our bloodlines like the roots of trees curling into one another underground. We carry them, not just as memory, but as biology. Their survival ensured our existence, and our existence reawakens their stories. Artifacts begin to make more sense in this light. Tools found near preserved bodies show precision, not desperation. Points of obsidian flaked with technique passed from hand to hand across generations. Needles carved from bone. Evidence of sewn garments, layered clothing that kept these humans alive in temperatures that would kill in hours. They weren't just surviving. They were solving, thinking, creating. And every frozen body becomes a new verse in that song of adaptation. But perhaps the most disorienting truth is this. They had art. Long before agriculture, before cities, before written language, they carved, painted, sang. The caves of Chauvet, Altamira, and others, while not the resting place of frozen remains, exist within the same lineage, the same world. They tell us that Ice Age humans had an interior life, a symbolic landscape. They dreamed. They marked time. They feared. They hoped. They danced in firelight and mourned their dead. We do not know their gods, but we know they had them. How could they not, in a world where every breath was a wager against the cold? Is it possible that what we call prehistory is not a lack of memory, but a language we have forgotten how to hear? Because when a frozen hand re-emerges from the permafrost, it is not reaching for us. We are reaching for it. We are following its gesture backward, into a time when the world was harder, but perhaps also more awake. Imagine the stillness of an Ice Age night. The sky above unpolluted, black beyond black, stars sharpened by cold. Around the fire, figures huddle, not primitive but precise. Every gesture, every word measured against survival. And yet they do not only survive. They teach, they remember. They whisper stories into the ears of children wrapped in furs. They laugh, they weep. They speak of spirits in the trees, of ancestors watching from the wind. The world was not dead. It was alive with meaning. Every footprint in the snow was a question. Every animal track a possibility. Every death a lesson. How could these people not be our kin when they lived with such presence? The more we study their remains, the more familiar they become. In the DNA of the Malta boy, a child buried near Lake Baikal, whose genes revealed links to both European and Native American lineages, we begin to glimpse the braided complexity of migration. The frozen tundra does not lie. It preserves not just the dead, but the paths they walked, the decisions they made, the cultures they built from bone, sinew, and hope. Through their tools we trace cognition. Through their diets, their migrations. Through their injuries, their resilience. They are not just data points. They are mirrors, and as the ice melts, the tempo quickens. Remains that once took decades to find are now surfacing yearly, even monthly, brought forth by warming temperatures and shifting ground. This is not only an archaeological windfall, it is a reckoning. For every body unearthed, there is a story no longer buried. For every mammoth exposed to air, there is a history we must now inherit. How do we listen to a world that never meant to speak again? This is the call of the ancients. Not a trumpet blast, but a quiet insistence, a low hum beneath the noise of modernity. When a mammoth's eye opens to the sun for the first time in 20,000 years, when the frozen teeth of a girl shine beneath meltwater, something is being asked of us. Not just to look, but to understand. Not just to study, but to carry forward what they could not. Because what vanished in the Ice Age was not only species, it was languages, it was ways of seeing, it was knowledge passed from mouth to mouth over fires that no longer burn. And now, as the frost recedes, we are being offered fragments, bones and blades, skin and stories. What will we do with them? Will we archive them in sterile rooms, or let them change the way we think of ourselves? What happens when history begins to thaw? It reveals not just the remains of individuals, but the outlines of entire worlds, the way they organized themselves, the landscapes they traversed, the dreams they carved into stone and buried with their dead. The frozen discoveries become less like evidence and more like conversation. Not a list of facts, but a gathering of voices. The Pleistocene does not recite a monologue, it invites a dialogue. Every strand of DNA is a sentence, every fire pit, a pause, every footpath, a memory of movement traced over time until the land itself remembers where we once walked. And in this unfolding, the illusion of distance breaks. We realize the Ice Age is not sealed behind a wall of time. It is stitched into the lining of our present. The air we breathe holds molecules once exhaled by mammoths. The soil beneath our cities covers stones once warmed by ancestral hands. Our bodies carry the scars and strengths of that ancient trial. The Ice Age does not sit behind us like a museum exhibit. It runs parallel, always just beneath the skin of now. The call of the ancients is not only about the past, it is about our own capacity to remember, not just intellectually, but viscerally. To remember that we are not the pinnacle, but a continuation. That our intelligence is not unprecedented, but inherited. That our fears, of darkness, of hunger, of isolation, are not modern anxieties, but ancient ones, encoded deep within the nervous system of our kind. And so the discoveries continue. A young girl with Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry found in Denisova cave. A child of hybrid worlds. Her existence. A quiet dismantling of our categories. Human history is not linear. It is not tidy. It is entangled, improvisational, and full of branching paths. To speak of the rise of Homo sapiens is not to tell a story of domination, but of interaction, of cohabitation, of shared firelight. We were never alone in our becoming. Is it possible that the Ice Age was not a harsh exile, but a crucible of connection? Because in the grip of cold, life contracts, but people draw closer. Families cluster together, communities tighten. Knowledge is not hoarded, but shared. Skills are passed from hand to hand like flint across the generations. In a world where nothing is certain, stories become maps, songs become shelters, and every face, even one frozen in permafrost, carries the weight of those who came before. What we find in the ice is not a frozen silence, but a preserved intimacy, a closeness unspoiled by time. The breath of the ancients may no longer rise in their chests, but it lingers, in artifacts, in genes, and in the questions we're only just beginning to ask. And the most pressing question may be the one we tend to avoid. What kind of world must collapse for these ancestors to reappear? The thaw is not gentle, it is not planned. It is a side effect of modern warming, of atmospheric imbalance, of our own accelerating pace. Permafrost that once held secrets is now crumbling at the edges. Bones surface not because we searched for them, but because the earth can no longer keep them buried. We're not just uncovering history, we are disturbing a graveyard that had until now honoured its silence. And still, they arrive. With every summer's melt, another child, another tooth, another spearhead. Sometimes a lock of hair, sometimes an entire life. And behind every discovery, a soft but insistent refrain. Remember us. Not in grandeur, not in conquest, but in presence. Remember us as the ones who walked before you, who made meaning from hardship, who lived without writing but not without wisdom. They are not asking for resurrection, they are asking for recognition. So what do we do when the dead begin to return? Do we treat them as relics or relatives? Do we enclose them in glass or allow them to re-enter our thinking? The Ice Age was not a pause, it was a chapter, and it did not end, it evolved. It lives in our marrow, in the curve of our hands, in the stories we tell to ward off the dark. This is the call of the ancients, not a call to arms, but a call to awareness, to humility, to attention. It does not demand action, it offers perspective. It invites us to see ourselves not as isolated phenomena, but as threads in a much older fabric. We are not the beginning, we are not the end, we are the echo and the listener. And perhaps that is why we feel so moved when we see their faces, whether in museum glass or in pixelated scans glowing faintly on lab screens. These are not the faces of strangers, they are kin. Their silence is not cold but contemplative. Their stillness is not void but filled with patience. They are not gone, they are waiting. Waiting for us to understand that the Ice Age is not over. It is simply sleeping beneath our feet, waiting for us to finally hear the call. And when we do, what we begin to hear is not a voice, but a wind, long, slow, and endless, threading across a continent sheathed in white. The Ice Age was not a singular event, not a cataclysmic freeze that descended overnight, but a rhythm, a long breath of the earth inhaling cold, exhaling glaciers, reshaping time itself through cycles of glaciation and retreat. It began more than 2.5 million years ago, and did not truly loosen its grip until barely 12,000 years before now. In that stretch, the world danced between extremes, ice and thaw, advance and collapse. And yet, even in its harshest phase, life did not halt. It adapted. It reimagined itself, and human beings, fragile in flesh but relentless in will, were among its most determined improvisers. Step outside that warmth of memory and into the tundra steppe. You're in what was once called Mammoth Steppe, a biome unlike anything left on Earth today. Stretching from Western Europe across Siberia and into Alaska, it spanned unbroken for thousands of miles, flat and frozen, but rich in grasses, herbs, and life. Herds of woolly mammoth moved in thunderous formations, bison clustered in the thousands, reindeer carved channels through the snow with hooves honed by repetition, and behind them, or alongside, came the humans, sometimes hunting, sometimes watching, sometimes only surviving. The cold was constant, but not just any cold. It was a creative force, a sculptor of ecosystems, a writer of constraints. It shaped where rivers froze and thawed, where trees vanished, where animals adapted into bulkier frames and denser fur. It shaped the humans too. Their tools grew more specialized, their shelters more inventive. Their fire, once accidental then habitual, that became sacred, not only as a source of warmth, but as a protector, a storyteller, a companion. The Ice Age did not give comfort easily, so our ancestors learned to weave it from spark and stone. What kind of mind does it take to live within a world that can kill you in a single night? Because it wasn't enough to merely endure. To persist through an endless winter meant to prepare, to predict, to remember. The glacial climate demanded more than strength. It required memory passed down in hands, in habits, in ritual. Food was dried, fermented, hidden. Routes were mapped without maps. Skins were sewn into layer upon layer, stitched with needles carved from bone and threaded with sinew. The cold asked questions, and humans answered in kind, not with defiance, but with ingenuity. And in this struggle, something else was born, not just tools and tactics, but culture, a worldview forged in scarcity, a way of being that found grace not in abundance, but in sharing. In firelight passed from hearth to hearth, in hands extended in bitter darkness. Because darkness was not a temporary condition, it was a season. Winter consumed more than half the year in many regions, and light returned only briefly, casting long shadows across snowfields where time seemed suspended, and, yet, this did not paralyze early humans, it focused them. The long dark was not empty. It was filled with presence. The hiss of wind through bone-hung shelters, the creak of sinew-strapped walls, the distant sound of wolves and the breath of mammoths steaming against the cold. It was in this environment that bonds were forged, not just between individuals but between generations. Fire became the heart of these early communities. Around it, children were taught without writing. Myths were passed not in books, but in voice, in rhythm, in song. Fire was not simply warmth. It was memory. It was instruction. It was trust. And above all, it was safety. Against the great unknown of the Pleistocene night, against predators, hunger, frostbite, the flame was a promise that morning would come again. What does it mean to build civilization not with stone walls, but with circles of warmth in the cold? The very tools they left behind tell this story. Flint points with wear patterns showing thousands of uses, scrapers smoothed down from repetitive contact with hide, hafted spears that combined wood, resin and stone into a single lethal line, a fusion of intuition and precision. Clothing wasn't just layered for insulation, it was engineered. Inner hides for warmth, outer furs for wind, tied close to the skin with cords, every detail adjusted over centuries, and what couldn't be solved alone was shared. Knowledge flowed not vertically but horizontally. No single invention would have saved a life, but the accumulation of micro-adaptations kept communities alive. Even social structures bent to the demands of the cold. Kinship groups likely expanded beyond strict blood ties because survival required numbers. An extra pair of hands could mean the difference between firewood gathered in time or frostbite. Elder knowledge was not optional, it was infrastructure. Those who remembered the last great freeze, who could read the clouds, who had walked the reindeer routes, they were invaluable. And so the old were not cast off. They were repositories, human libraries breathing beside the fire. And then there was the land itself, vast, unknowable, unforgiving, but not empty. These people did not think of nature as backdrop. It was animate, it was watching. The wind carried voices, the animals held power, and the cold. The cold was not just weather, it was will, it was presence. It had moods, intentions, patterns. It was listened to, spoken to, honoured. What kind of stories are born when the world around you is always stronger than you are? They are stories of humility, of reverence, of unseen forces and eternal cycles. These were not tales told for entertainment. They were maps, moral compasses, warnings etched in myth. When the wind howled through the bones of the land, it carried lessons. When a mammoth fell, it was not just meat. It was an offering, a moment to remember the cost of survival. The Ice Age shaped not only the physical bodies of humans, but the architecture of their inner lives. The cold carved beliefs just as surely as it carved valleys beneath glaciers. It is likely that every hunt was accompanied by ritual, a gesture to the sky, a song whispered over a carcass, a marking made in the soil. Because to take life in a world where death was always nearby, that required balance. Many archaeologists now believe that early humans saw themselves as part of a system, not rulers over it. When we find ochre scattered at burial sites or beads carved from bone resting against tiny skeletons, we are not seeing decoration, we are seeing connection. A human reaching beyond the moment of death, unsure but hopeful that something or someone is listening. Even caves and those cold, echoing stone wombs became more than shelter. They became sacred. In France, in Spain, in Russia, handprints appear on walls, often layered over animal figures and abstract symbols, fingers pressed into clay, pigment blown through hollow bones. The act itself mattered as much as the image. To leave one's mark in a place of darkness was to say, I am here. I was here. Remember me, not as a conqueror, as a witness. Can we still understand what it means to live in a world where nothing is guaranteed and every warmth is borrowed? Today we often imagine progress as insulation, more heat, more shelter, more control. But for Ice Age people, survival depended on listening, on adapting, on learning to speak the language of the land and the season. The cold was not always the enemy. It was a force to be respected. It taught restraint. It demanded foresight. And in that constraint, creativity bloomed. From musical instruments carved from vulture bones, to beads strung into ceremonial adornments, to graves so carefully prepared they echo with tenderness across millennia, the evidence suggests not just endurance, but imagination. The cold did not silence them. It gave them a reason to speak. And what they said, through gesture, through pigment, through silence wrapped in burial, was that they saw themselves not as separate from the world, but woven into its breath. In the Pleistocene, the earth did not need to be imagined as alive. It simply was. Its moods were felt in every gust, its anger in every failed hunt, its mercy in the return of spring light. When the sun rose higher after months of dim arc, that light was not taken for granted. It was received like a god, or perhaps like an ancestor, remembered and welcomed back. What kind of calendar do you build when time itself is a question of light and dark? Bones found arranged in patterns beneath glacial loess speak of ceremonies, not for show, not for performance, but for balance. Even now in Siberia, among indigenous groups whose traditions stretch across unbroken lineage, the cold is not only measured in degrees, it has names, faces, and while the world of the Ice Age is gone, its grammar may still whisper through those practices, a legacy of sacred cold passed mouth to mouth across tens of thousands of years. Because in a world where failure often meant extinction, survival was never just technical, it was moral. The hunt required intention, the burial required respect, the story required truth. When food ran low, when frost cracked the bones of huts, it was not just cleverness that saved lives, it was memory, it was ritual, it was trust, not just in each other, but in forces unseen. The Ice Age was not a war, it was a covenant. You could live, but only if you listened. Even the stars, emerging like flint sparks in the deepest night, were not merely decoration overhead. They were signs, guides, witnesses. Did our ancestors name them? Did they draw maps with them? Did they see in them the eyes of spirits or the footprints of prey? We do not know, but what we do know is this. They looked. They wondered. They built meaning from the same sky we still stand beneath. And it is here, in this practice of awe, this discipline of wonder in the face of severity, that something distinctly human emerges. To be cold, to be tired, to be surrounded by silence, and yet to reach for something beyond what is visible. That is not just intelligence, it is reverence. What happens to a species when its first gods are made of snow and wind? Perhaps it learns to listen before it speaks. Perhaps it learns that silence is not emptiness but presence. In the Ice Age, divinity was not located in a distant heaven. It was all around, in the breath of animals, in the sharp crack of thawing rivers, in the aurora flickering across polar skies. The people of this age lived in a cathedral without walls, with rituals inscribed not in text but in gesture, not in doctrine but in repetition. Every hunt was a prayer. Every winter survived, a confirmation. Not of dominance, but of acceptance. The earliest known figurines, as carved from ivory stone or mammoth bone, show not warriors or kings, but wide-hipped figures, pregnant forms, curved silhouettes, symbols of fertility, of life, of continuity. In a world ruled by death and ice, the sacred was not destruction, but return, the cycle, the re-emergence. To carve such a shape with frozen fingers and place it beside a fire was not superstition. It was affirmation that life still mattered, that the human story would not end in snow. And now, thousands of years later, we are the descendants of that hope. Every tool we lift from the ground, every jawbone, every shard of obsidian, every strand of DNA from a frozen corpse, these are not just data points, they are echoes of resilience. And when we feel distant from those ancestors, all we must do is step outside on a cold night, hold our breath, and remember they were here. They felt this wind, they touched this earth, they saw the same stars and shaped myths from their flickering. This is the legacy of the endless winter, not desolation, but depth. A landscape not of death, but of discovery. It demanded everything, and so it revealed everything. Human capacity, human weakness, human wonder. Beneath its weight, the species did not break, it became. And what do we become when we remember that we emerge not from paradise, but from peril? We become attentive, we become careful, we become grateful. We learn to read again the signs in nature, to feel again the presence in the silence. The age of endless winter was not just an epoch of ice. It was the forge in which our humanity was tested, tempered, and born anew. And the cold, though it has receded, has never truly left. It lingers in the stories, in the rituals, in the shapes of our bones and the instincts of our minds. And if we are quiet, if we are still, we may yet hear it speaking, waiting, teaching, calling us to remember who we are. And perhaps memory itself was their greatest invention. Not the wheel, not the spear, not even fire, but the act of remembrance, of tethering the present to the past through form and pigment and ritual. Long before script, before number, before even the seed of agriculture was planted in warming soil, our Ice Age ancestors were already inscribing meaning. In stone, in earth, in the hidden cathedral walls of caves, they reached through time not by surviving it, but by addressing it. They were not merely enduring the world, they were responding to it. Step into the cave of Chauvet, sealed for tens of thousands of years beneath the cliffs of southern France. There, flickering torchlight reveals what time has not erased. Panels of lions in motion, rhinos charging, horses layered in overlapping gallops. But they are not just animals. They are choices, compositions. The walls themselves curve with intention, the shapes placed where the rock bulges or dips, using natural contours as part of the image. These were not idle marks. They were orchestration, gesture married to surface, a form of seeing that required not just observation but imagination. What kind of mind does it take to invent painting, not as reproduction, but as invocation? Pigment was not abundant. Ochre had to be mined, ground, mixed. Charcoal had to be burned, collected, prepared. Even the act of blowing pigment onto the wall, a hand stencil left in negative space, was labour, breath spent with purpose. The hand says, I was here. The absent says, I am gone. The gesture says, remember. And this act of remembering extended beyond art. Burials during the late Pleistocene carry signs of something deeper than disposal. We find children wrapped in red ochre, laid beside ivory beads and carved figurines. We find adults buried with hunting tools, with animal bones shaped not for utility but for beauty. In Sungir, in what is now Russia, 2 children were found adorned with thousands of hand-carved beads, each one requiring hours of work. Some researchers estimate that their burial garments alone took over 10,000 hours to create. What kind of society devotes that much effort to its dead? One that understands that memory is not an accident. It is crafted. To bury with care is to declare that the person mattered, that the absence will not go unnoticed, and more than that, to bury with beauty is to say that death, while feared, is not meaningless, that there is continuity, that the human story does not end in stillness but in transformation. So what was it they feared? And what was it they hoped would be remembered? Perhaps they feared not death itself, but disappearance, oblivion, the erasure of a name, a voice, a presence from the fabric of time. And perhaps they hoped that through gesture, the careful placing of a body, the etching of a spiral into bone, the pressing of a hand to cave wall, something of the self would persist. Memory was not automatic. It had to be shaped. And in shaping it, they were shaping us. Because we are not the first to wonder where we came from. We are not the first to sit in the dark and ask what lies beyond the firelight. Every scratched pattern, every carved antler tine, every painted panel, they are responses to that same question. And if we listen, not only with our eyes but with our empathy, we begin to hear the rhythm beneath the form, a rhythm of longing, of intention, of a mind reaching outward. Symbolic behaviour is not trivial. It requires abstraction. It requires the ability to understand that this line represents that animal, that gesture speaks of that loss, that mark holds that meaning. It requires community agreement, that this means something, that we agree to carry that meaning together. So when we find signs, repeated across caves or artifacts, zigzags, dots, cross-hatching, crescents. We are not looking at doodles. We are looking at the early scaffolding of language, not spoken, not written, but shared nonetheless. And then there are the figurines, carved from mammoth ivory or stone, found far from any settlement, tucked into graves or left in hidden places. Some represent animals, some exaggerated human forms, some mysterious hybrids, half human, half beast. The Löwenmensch, the lion-headed figure found in a German cave, stands over a foot tall and dates back more than 35,000 years. Carved with tools less efficient than a modern nail file, it may have taken hundreds of hours to create. Why would people invest such time and effort into an object that offered no utility? Because utility is not the only measure of value. Because memory, once externalized, becomes an anchor. Because to create is to resist entropy. And perhaps that is what they were doing, resisting the pull of silence, of forgetting, of nothingness. By shaping the world in image and story, they made space for meaning, not just for the living, but for those yet to come. And in that act, we find the birth of legacy. Because legacy is not about power. It is about continuity. It is the belief that something of us can live beyond us, in symbols, in traces, in the echoes we leave behind. And it is this belief, more than any tool or weapon, that defines the earliest artists of time. They were not passive inhabitants of their age. They were active participants in the unfolding of meaning. When they pressed pigment into stone, they were doing more than decoration. They were declaring presence. They were whispering forward. Even the structure of caves, the choice of where to place an image, speaks to intent. Many paintings are located deep within labyrinths of stone, far from the entrance where no natural light reaches. These spaces were not stumbled into, they were sought out. Torches had to be made, carried, maintained. Breath would have grown shallow in those narrow chambers. The acoustics shift, the temperature drops, the darkness thickens. And yet, they went there, not for necessity but for expression, for something sacred, to bring light into darkness and then to leave a mark. And this leaves us with questions that cannot be measured in radiocarbon or DNA. What did they believe they were doing? Were these hunts reenacted as ceremony? Were animals drawn to honour their spirit or to summon their presence? Were dots and lines attempts at counting, at tracking the moon, at predicting the return of the herds? Or were they prayers, acts of devotion carved into the bones of the earth itself? We do not know, and perhaps we never will. But uncertainty does not mean emptiness. It means humility. It means learning to read traces not with certainty, but with reverence. These were not people half-formed, not minds in waiting. They were complex, attentive, and profoundly expressive. The same hands that chipped flint to kill, shaped ivory to remember. The same minds that learned how to cross frozen rivers dreamed of lions with human faces. And so we begin to see the frozen not as accidental survivors, but as chosen messengers, not because they meant to be preserved, but because their world was so full of meaning, even its remnants still speak. Their memories, once etched in pigment and bone, now echo in algorithms and glass cases. But the core remains, the desire to endure, not just in body, but in story. What does it mean that our first legacy as a species was not conquest, but art? It means that before we built monuments, we built metaphors. It means that before we tamed fire or animals or land, we turned inward and gave shape to what we felt. These first acts of creation were not products of stability. They were born in hardship, in scarcity, in climates where food was never guaranteed, where death was a nearby companion. And yet in that world of cold and bone, we chose to make beauty, not as luxury, but as necessity. Because memory is not a luxury, it is survival by other means. To remember a season is to learn from it. To remember a face is to grieve it. To remember a death is to prepare for your own. And to remember through creation is to make that memory shareable, durable. It is to resist the forgetting that time imposes. It is to refuse silence. And so art became the earliest form of time travel. Not just cave paintings, but tattoos etched into skin. Songs passed from throat to throat. Objects buried in graves to travel with the soul. These were acts of preservation not just of culture, but of presence. To create something that outlasts you, even if only for a few days, is to step briefly outside the rush of entropy. And this stepping outside becomes the first architecture of culture. A memory kept is a pattern repeated. A gesture performed again becomes a ritual. A ritual shared becomes a belief. A belief recorded becomes a story. And a story passed on and layered through generations becomes a people. This is the long unfolding of identity. And it begins not with bloodlines, but with meaning. So when we peer into these caves, when we dust off beads or fragments of ochre-stained bone, we are not just analysing artefacts. We are reading the first pages of a story that includes us. A story of humans learning to carry their dead, to carry their dreams, to carry their fears, not in silence, but in symbol. And the frozen, those whose bodies were preserved by chance and climate, are not only bodies, they are bookmarks in that story. Some are buried with shells from coasts hundreds of miles away. Some wear ornaments whose only purpose was to be seen. They lived in a world of scarcity, and yet they adorned themselves. Why? Because memory needed a costume, because loss needed a language, and perhaps the most human thing we ever did was look at a blank surface, a wall, a stone, a body, and decide it meant something. Meaning did not arrive as a thunderclap. It accumulated, layered like pigment on a cave wall, whispered through the repetition of ritual, etched into bone, one line at a time. Our ancestors did not invent culture in a single moment. They constructed it through memory, through metaphor, through the decision to keep what could not be touched. They were not just survivors of ice and time. They were the keepers of significance. This is what we inherit from them. Not just DNA, not just tools, but the impulse to narrate, the drive to bind ourselves to place, to people, to past. We still place stones on graves. We still light fires in memory. We still write names, draw symbols, mark moments. The medium changes. The need does not. And in that sense, the frozen dead are not trapped in time. They are part of a continuum. They looked at death and did not only fear it, they prepared for it, shaped it, named it. And in doing so, they shaped us. They taught us that to live fully means to anticipate loss and to create in defiance of it. Their caves were not cathedrals, but they were sacred. Their graves were not uniform, but they were deliberate. Their art was not linear, but it was layered with care. Every act of making was an act of remembering, and every act of remembering was a resistance against the cold indifference of time. So when you stand before a handprint in red ochre, remember, this was not the signature of a primitive mind. It was the vow of an artist, a parent, a lover, a mourner. It was a declaration that they were here, that they mattered, that they saw and wanted to be seen. And what do we make now in our age of glass and data that will last as long? What mark will we leave that can survive not just centuries but epochs? What will remain of us when our machines fail and our screens go dark? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps only stories. Perhaps only the need to make them. And so the makers of memory continue to speak, not in language, but in presence. They do not ask us to understand them perfectly. They ask us to remember that we are not the beginning, that the urge to leave something behind is older than we can imagine, and that in every mark we make, we are not just recording time, we are becoming it. And as we become time itself, we turn once more to the bodies it has preserved, the silent witnesses who did not intend to endure but did. They lie beneath soil and snow, encased in ice, wrapped in stone, and we do not merely excavate them. We interrogate them. Every hair, every tooth, every cell becomes a portal. They do not speak, but they testify. And what they tell us, with the quiet, unflinching precision of molecular memory, is that they were not myths. They were people, with diets, with diseases, with rituals, with names we will never know but lives we can still read. It begins with DNA, ancient, fragile, coiled in the hollow of bone and the base of teeth, locked within cells that have not breathed for tens of thousands of years. To recover it is to perform a kind of resurrection, not of soul, but of sequence. Scientists do not scoop it like treasure. They extract it carefully, layer by layer, using clean labs sealed from modern breath, wearing suits like surgeons in a sterile temple. A single strand, if preserved, can reveal ancestry, kinship, migration, even moments of love and war, the mingling of bloodlines across the millennia. And from this code we begin to map not just individuals, but populations. The Siberian child, discovered buried with ochre and beads in permafrost, tells us through her genome that she belonged to a lineage that links Eurasia to the Americas. She's not only a body, she's a bridge, a whisper that says, we moved, we mingled, we belong to something larger than this grave. But DNA alone is not the whole story. The frozen are not just blueprints, they are environments. In the teeth of the Ice Maiden we find traces of diet, starches, fibres, the remnants of roots and seeds. In her stomach, fragments of her last meal, not just what she ate, but when, what season, what climate. In her hair, the isotopic signatures of water she drank, soils she touched, toxins she absorbed. Her body is a landscape, compressed into flesh. A narrative written in chemical traces, and as we scan these bodies with CT, with mass spectrometry, with isotope analysis, we begin to assemble lives. What sicknesses they carried, what injuries they survived, what age they reached. One man had a healed fracture across his ribs, evidence of trauma and time. Another had tooth wear that suggests habitual use of the mouth for carrying. Leatherwork, perhaps. A woman with tattoos preserved in the cold, ink stitched into skin not for decoration alone, but perhaps for medicine, for identity, for meaning. How do we hold these bodies? Not as objects, not as spectacles, but as chapters torn from a book the world forgot to finish. We hold them slowly, carefully, with the silence they deserve. And when we open that book, gently, deliberately, we find stories too detailed to invent. In the stomach of a child frozen in Siberia, scientists found pollen grains from summer wildflowers. This means she died in late spring or early summer. It means she walked through meadows before her death. It means the last air she breathed carried the same seeds that still bloom in the tundra today. A life once abstract, now blooming for a moment in colour and scent. Elsewhere in the Andes, a girl sits cross-legged, eyes closed, lips pursed in perfect preservation. The Ice Maiden, as she's called, was buried high on a volcanic slope, likely as a sacrifice. Her organs are intact. Her skin still flush with blood when discovered. Traces of coca leaves were found in her mouth, along with signs of maize beer, a ceremonial preparation. But what lingers most is not the science. It is her posture, her stillness. The way time folded over her so gently it did not crush her, only paused. And this is what the frozen reveal, again and again. Not just how they died, but how they lived. What they wore, fibres preserved against the chill. What they carried, tools, ornaments, even flowers. One child in the Altai Mountains was buried with a carved wooden horse. A toy, perhaps, or a symbol, or both. We will never know his name, but we know he mattered to someone. Someone placed that horse in the grave with care. Someone mourned. From the Alps we recovered Ötzi, a man who died over 5,000 years ago, encased in glacier ice. His body preserved with a detail that defies time. He carried a copper axe, a bow, berries in his gut, and complex tattoos across his joints. He had an arrow wound in his shoulder. He had arthritis. He had fungus for medicine sewn into cords. He had shoes stuffed with grass for insulation. A man, aging, hunted, surviving, and finally, dying. But even in death, his body refused disappearance. All these frozen people were once warm. They walked. They laughed. They suffered. They made choices even in their final hours. Their presence now, chilled, dissected, studied, is not passive. They are participants in the story of who we are. And while science decodes their matter, it cannot always answer their meaning. Because here, we reach the threshold between knowledge and reverence. A tooth can tell us what a child ate. A hair can tell us where a woman travelled. But neither can tell us who they loved, what they feared, what story they whispered to themselves as the cold crept in. That is not to diminish science. It is to expand it, to invite us into a fuller reading of the past, one that does not treat these bodies as puzzles to solve but as people to meet. Frozen, yes, but not mute. And here, a question rises that science cannot ignore. What does it mean, ethically, emotionally, to study the dead? To hold the body of a child who never consented to this gaze? To photograph the face of someone who was once mourned, now displayed beneath museum lights? These are not new questions, but they grow louder with each new discovery. Indigenous communities have rightly asked, who owns the past? Who speaks for the dead? When does curiosity become intrusion? Some remains have been returned, reburied, given back to the earth they came from. Others remain in collections, subjects of endless scanning, sampling, sequencing, and in each case we must ask, is this for understanding or for control? Still, the bodies remain. They do not accuse, they do not explain, they simply endure. A girl buried with textiles and feathers, a boy found with traces of milk in his teeth, a man still clutching his tools caught mid-step by a snowstorm 5,000 years ago. These are not just scientific specimens. They are stories interrupted and resumed. And each body we find, whether on a windswept slope deep in a cave or beneath Arctic tundra, reminds us of the fragility of memory, the miracle of preservation, and the responsibility of attention. When the wind buried them, it did not mean to keep them. When the ice closed in, it did not conspire to protect. And yet, by chance or by rhythm, they remained, not to be uncovered, but to be witnessed. We do not own them, we inherit them, and with that inheritance comes the burden of humility. Because these frozen witnesses are not here for spectacle, they are here to be heard. Because when we study these ancient remains, we are not peering downward into the past. We are reaching sideways, to ancestors, to kin, to reflections of ourselves who lived in different light. The line that separates us is thin, thinner than we'd like to believe. It dissolves in the warm breath of empathy, and in that breath, we find not relics, but relatives. They were not other. They were us, in another shape of the world. And so their bodies, preserved by accident, recovered by intention, become teachers. The ancient DNA they carry doesn't just speak to ancestry, but to evolution. How genes adapted to diet, to climate, to disease. The lactose tolerance mutation, for example, tells us about cultural shifts in food. Traces of pathogens found in soft tissues reveal long histories of sickness and immunity. Even the microflora of their mouths opens windows into ancient microbiomes, lost ecosystems that once lived inside us. These details don't just inform the past, they reshape our present. Medical research, evolutionary biology, climate studies, all benefit from the strange, slow generosity of the frozen. Even forensic sciences have learned from them, studying decomposition and preservation under unique conditions. But beyond the data, there is still the deeper current, the human one. The ache of looking into a face that once blinked in the sun, now sealed in ice. The gravity of lifting a body from the earth and knowing it was once cradled by hands not so different from yours. And when a preserved child is placed on a sterile table, surrounded by masks and machines, we must ask not only what we can learn, but what it costs to learn it. These are not questions of policy, they are questions of character. Because for every detail we uncover, the tilt of a skull, the staining on a tooth, there remains the unknown, the unmeasurable, the story that is no longer in the body but once lived inside it. And maybe that's the final gift these frozen witnesses offer, the invitation to balance, to hold knowledge and wonder together, to match technique with tenderness, to see in every ancient ribcage not just bones, but breath, not just data, but dignity. And as we step away from their resting places or archive them in digital vaults, the question lingers. What is our obligation to the dead? To study is not to possess. To remember is not to consume. There is a line, thin but vital, between honouring the past and mining it. And each time we gaze into the eyes of a body preserved in frost, we stand at that line. Are we gathering knowledge to illuminate life, or to fill our own hunger for mystery? And more importantly, are we listening? Because these frozen witnesses, quiet as they are, still speak. Their silence is not absence, it is presence held in suspension. It invites us to slow down, to notice, to remember that science at its best is not conquest, but care. In this way, every ancient burial becomes a kind of mirror. We look in, and we see not just tools and bones, but choices, values, a worldview shaped by the same forces we feel today: love, grief, wonder, fear. The decision to place a child in red ochre, to wrap a body in fur and flowers, to carve beads for a stranger's final breath. These were acts of meaning, made by hands we might have held, and so when we scan their teeth, or isolate their genomes, or map their isotopic pathways, let us not forget the deeper message, that a life, no matter how long extinguished, leaves an outline, and that outline deserves more than measurement, it deserves respect. From the Siberian girl curled in ochre, to the ice maiden seated in a trance of death, to the unnamed child who once clutched a wooden horse beneath a glacier sky. Each is a point of contact. Each is a story we almost lost. Each is a reminder that the line between present and past is made of ice, and sometimes that ice melts just enough for us to listen. These are the frozen witnesses, not symbols, not relics, not even ancestors exactly, but humans. And what they gave us, whether they meant to or not, is a gift we are only beginning to understand. The ability to remember not just what we were, but who we still are. And yet memory alone could not keep our ancestors warm. In a world gripped by the great glaciers, where the wind moved like knives through mammoth grass and darkness swallowed entire seasons, survival required more than remembrance. It required fire. It required fellowship. It required an imagination fierce enough to shape warmth out of cold. Because the Ice Age was not only an era, it was a test, not of strength, but of ingenuity. And through that frost something astonishing happened. The human mind caught flame. It's easy to forget what fire means when it arrives with a match. But in the deep past, fire was not a tool. It was a god. A creature coaxed from friction, captured from lightning, or preserved like treasure through migrations and storms. Fire was heat, light, protection, and communion. To keep it burning was to resist death. And our ancestors learned to master it not just in hearths, but in movement. They migrated with the seasons, following herds, crossing frozen rivers, timing their journeys with the rhythm of melt and frost. They were not aimless wanderers. They were mapmakers in a world without signs, guided by stars, scent, memory, and flame. And when they stopped, they built camps around fire like planets around a sun. These were not random gatherings, but circles of intention. Meat was roasted, hides dried, tools crafted. But something else happened too. Stories were spoken. Shadows moved against cave walls not as tricks but as language. Fire made space not only for survival, but for meaning. What happens when warmth is shared? When fear is spoken aloud in the dark and someone listens? In this circle of heat and breath, the first architectures of human society formed. And these weren't crude or accidental. They were expressions of choice. The placement of stones, the building of windbreaks, the laying of firs. These decisions created boundaries between the wild and the safe, between the predator and the protected. In the coldest hours, fire meant more than life. It meant identity. Who held the flame decided who held the story, and so fire became inheritance. Passed not just as embers, but as knowledge. Where to find dry kindling, how to build a windproof spark, how to cook marrow from bone and medicine from root. These weren't just tasks. They were acts of trust, of mentorship. They bound generations. They created a line between the forgotten and the remembered. But could fire alone explain how we endured? Could it alone hold the weight of extinction at bay? No, not without each other. Fire is a tool, but community is an architecture. In the cold of the Ice Age, a lone figure could not last long. The blizzard did not care for strength. The mammoth did not flinch at pride. It was through cooperation that our ancestors became more than animals. The cold sharpened not only bones and blades, but bonds. And in those bonds, something sacred emerged. The interweaving of survival and story. To share warmth was to share trust. To hunt together was to accept risk for the sake of another. To raise a child, to tend to the sick, to mourn the dead. None of this could happen in isolation. These were communal acts, And so the idea of us deepened. Not just bloodline, but belonging. Not just kin, but kind. And in that belonging, storytelling flourished. Around the fire, facts became fable. Lessons took the shape of animal spirits, of ancestors reborn in the stars, of creatures that could shift between worlds. These weren't just entertainment. They were maps of meaning. They taught where the herds moved, when the rivers froze, what dreams to fear, and what beasts to follow. Through voice and gesture, knowledge was passed not as command, but as vision. It became participatory. It became remembered. And through story, children were shaped long before they hunted. The elderly, long past their physical peak, became the holders of time. They knew which berries healed and which paths led home. Their value was not in muscle, but in memory. This alone tells us something profound. That Ice Age society was not built purely on strength, but on the balance of body and mind. It recognized wisdom as utility. It made reverence part of the strategy of survival. Even ritual emerged here, not as religion in the modern sense, but as rhythm. A dance to mimic the deer's steps, a chant to call back the sun, a carved object passed from hand to hand before a journey. These weren't empty superstitions. They were frameworks for courage. When faced with the abyss of snow and silence, symbols filled the space where certainty could not reach. This is what the cold demanded. Not just invention, but imagination. And it's here that we see the outline of something new. A kind of identity that was no longer just reactive, not just built from need, but from meaning. To live was to remember. To remember was to belong. And to belong was to transform the environment, not by conquering it, but by naming it. Ice became map. Rivers became veins. The stars were not distant. They were guides, ancestors, listeners. The earth was not just terrain. It was kin. This transformation of the environment into identity was not metaphorical. It was functional. It helped people orient themselves, emotionally and physically, across a land that changed every season. And in naming what they feared, what they followed, what they hoped for, early humans began to reshape the world from the inside out. Consider the Mammoth Steppe, a vast frozen savanna stretching from Western Europe to the Bering Strait. To us, it seems bleak, endless grass and wind. But to Ice Age humans, it was alive with possibility. Herds pulsed across it like blood through the veins of a body. Hills held memories. Groves became landmarks. A place was never just where, it was when, who, why. And in this rich psychological geography, imagination became the truest compass. A hunter knew not just where the herd had passed, but what the tracks meant, how old they were, what mood the wind was in. Sensory awareness heightened, not from instinct alone, but from a mind trained by story. The earth spoke, and they listened. They painted it too, on cave walls, on stone, in ochre and charcoal and breath. These were not idle decorations, they were affirmations. We are here, and this is what we see. This is what we chase. This is what we remember. And in these marks, we see a self-aware species in the act of defining its world, not through domination, but through dialogue. That dialogue extended to animals, to weather, to the unseen. Spirits weren't separate from nature. They were woven into it. A fox might be a messenger, a blizzard, a warning. The line between myth and environment blurred, not because people were irrational, but because they were embedded. They belonged. The environment shaped the rhythm of their lives, and in return they shaped its meaning. And what emerges from this exchange is not the caricature of primitive life, but a model of resilience fused with reverence. These people were cold, yes, often hungry, but they were not lost. They were in conversation with each other, with their ancestors, and with the earth. They were fragile, yes, but not helpless. Because what they understood, perhaps better than we do now, is that survival isn't just about the tools we carry. It's about the stories we believe. To endure was not merely to eat and sleep. It was to understand oneself as part of something larger, a lineage, a land, a cycle. These weren't abstractions. They were survival strategies. In the deep cold, Memory and imagination became as important as blades and fire. And through that fusion of necessity and narrative, the Ice Age became more than a period in geologic time. It became a crucible for human culture. The seasons themselves shaped identity. Migration wasn't just a movement of bodies, it was a calendar, a ritual, a renewal. When spring returned, it wasn't merely a thaw, it was rebirth. When the first footprints pressed into melt-soft soil, it was an invocation. We are still here. We return. Clothing became more than warmth. It became signal. Sinew-stitched hides, beads of bone, dyed fibres, all spoke of group, of memory, of meaning. What clan you belonged to, what stories your people told, what spirits your ancestors walked with. These visual languages were carried on bodies, just as oral stories were carried on breath, and over time something else emerged, the sense that the world responded to you, not because humans ruled it, but because they respected it. This was the paradox of Ice Age life. Immense vulnerability alongside immense imagination. You could be taken by the cold in a single night, and yet in that same cold you could dream, you could sing, you could name the stars. This tension is what defined our ancestors, not brute dominance but poetic resilience. They didn't just survive the Ice Age, they made something of it. They lit fires not only in camps but in each other, with shared purpose, shared memory and shared myth. This is how we must see them. Not as figures shivering in fur, but as minds ablaze within the frost. They were sculptors of identity, using cold and story as their tools. Their world was harsh, yes, but it was not silent. It hummed with meaning. And they listened closely enough to respond. That response became a legacy, a flame we still carry. Because even now, thousands of years after the glaciers retreated and the mammoths fell silent, that fire still burns in us. We may light it with buttons and switches, but the instinct behind it is ancient. To gather, to share, to tell. We warm ourselves not only by heat, but by presence, by the stories that pass between us, by the quiet, invisible thread of meaning stretched from the past to our hands, and that thread began here, in the frost, in the dark, where humans did not just endure, but invented endurance. They did not merely adapt, they translated hardship into relationship. They shaped landscapes into lifescapes. Their myths became maps. Their fires became family. And that transformation of environment into identity continues in us. We still mark seasons with stories. We still signal belonging with garments and rituals. We still migrate, in thought, in memory, in hope. We still look to the stars and find versions of ourselves. We are not as modern as we pretend. Much of who we are was formed in the cold. And perhaps that's what the Ice Age gave us more than anything. The proof that fragility is not weakness. That simplicity can hold genius. That intelligence doesn't always look like invention. Sometimes it looks like listening. Like staying. Like knowing when to move on and when to stay and sing into the firelight. This is the truth behind the myth of primitive people. They were not failed attempts at us. They were fully realized versions of themselves, solving different problems, living in different dreams, but dreaming nonetheless. And their dreams lit paths we still walk. So the next time you feel a fire's warmth, think of them. Not as shadows, not as strangers, but as voices, echoing across frost and flame. They were cold, yes, but they were never alone. And yet, even that truth carries a deeper meaning, one far more literal than we once believed. Because in those ice-choked valleys, beneath skies thick with snow and memory, our ancestors were not the only humans. There were others, other minds, other fires, other hands carving into bone, weaving into hide, shaping the darkness with sparks of intelligence. And now, with the careful reading of ancient DNA, we are forced to reconsider a story we thought we understood. Humanity was never a single-threaded lineage. It was a braid, tangled, frayed, woven with the breath of many voices. The Ice Age was not a stage upon which Homo sapiens emerged triumphant. It was a gathering, a convergence, a quiet conversation between distant cousins. How do we reckon with this revelation? That buried within the cells of our bones is a whisper from the Neanderthal, that in the deep code of our blood lingers the trace of Denisovan breath. We are not one thing. We never were. The boundaries we imagined, between human and other, between us and them, begin to blur like mist above a glacial stream. Once the Neanderthal was a caricature, brutish, slow, doomed. But the truth is more beautiful and more complex. They crafted tools with precision, buried their dead with care, painted caves and fashioned jewellery from eagle talons. They lived in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years before we arrived, not as shadows, but as sovereigns of their world. They were not waiting to be replaced. They were being. And then came us, Homo sapiens, emerging from Africa like a tide, not of conquest, but of expansion. We did not meet the Neanderthals in battle. We met them in the forest, at river crossings, in caves warmed by shared fire. And what happened in those encounters was not extinction by sword, but absorption by breath. We mingled, we mated, we blended. The human tree did not split, it intertwined. The same is true of the Denisovans, that enigmatic branch known first from a single finger bone found in a Siberian cave. They were not ghosts, they were kin. And their legacy lives on, especially in the DNA of people from Asia and Oceania. Adaptations to high-altitude breathing in modern Tibetans? That's a Denisovan gift. So what does it mean then to be human, when humanity is no longer a point but a cloud, a spectrum, a murmuration of related minds, each adapting to the cold in its own way, yet drawn together by curiosity, contact, and the quiet grammar of survival? The evidence for this braided lineage does not lie in myth or metaphor. It lies in the bones, in the tools, in the soot-blackened walls of shared shelter. At Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, a Neanderthal was buried with pollen from wildflowers, a detail so delicate it suggests a ritual, a parting marked by tenderness. At Châtel-Perronian sites in France, tools appear that blend Neanderthal and Homo sapiens designs, blades and ornaments that tell of borrowing, mimicking, perhaps even collaboration. It was not a collision, it was a dialogue. We shared landscapes, we shared prey, we shared fears and likely, even songs. In times of scarcity, perhaps we traded flint or food or stories told by gesture and gaze, and in moments we cannot know, moments without artifact or fossil, we shared flesh. Children born of interspecies unions, infants who bore the genetic signatures of more than one kind of human, growing into people who could not be easily categorized. They were not anomalies, they were us. Modern genomics confirms it. Nearly everyone alive today carries between 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. Some populations also carry Denisovan DNA. These aren't footnotes, they are chapters. And yet, it is only recently that we've begun to accept this fully. That Homo sapiens is not a lone protagonist in a simple evolutionary story, but one voice in a larger chorus. And within that chorus, the distinctions begin to soften. If they buried their dead, if they painted animals in ochre, if they held their infants close, what then makes them not us? Was it the shape of their skull, the angle of their tools, or was it just that we were the ones who survived? That question lingers, not to accuse, but to awaken. Because in the presence of other humans, the mirror we hold to ourselves becomes more complex. We begin to see that humanity is not a border to be patrolled, but a threshold to be approached. And those thresholds existed not just in the Ice Age, but within us still. We carry them like quiet passengers, a bit of Neanderthal skin biology here, a Denisovan immune gene there. Adaptations not just to cold, but to altitude, to disease, to the 1,000 cuts of daily survival. These were not genetic anomalies, they were gifts, and they were exchanged not through conquest, but through proximity, through mingling, through nights beside the same fire looking up at the same stars. But can bones and genes alone tell the whole story? No. The truer evidence is in the tools, the dwellings, the adornments, in the subtle fingerprints of culture. At sites in Spain and France, we find Neanderthal-made pendants, pigments, perhaps even musical instruments. In Siberia, Denisovans left behind finely crafted tools that challenge the idea of a crude cousin. These were not dull minds mimicking the brighter light of sapiens. They were innovators in their own right, sculptors of flint, tamers of fire, artists of survival. At some sites we find sapiens and Neanderthal artifacts layered together, sometimes so closely, so interwoven in time and space, that the distinction between them begins to dissolve. Shared methods, borrowed patterns, parallel adaptations, and perhaps, though we cannot yet prove it, shared beliefs. What happens when two kinds of humans bury their dead in the same cave? What does it mean when a Neanderthal wears a pendant of pierced shell, just as Homo sapiens did hundreds of kilometres away? What does it mean when both groups seem to mark the seasons with colour, with symbol, with flame? It means the boundary was never as clean as we imagined. And so we arrive at the deeper question, one that hums beneath the DNA, beneath the soil, beneath the ice. What defines us? Is it biology, behaviour, language, empathy? If Neanderthals mourned their dead and Denisovans passed on tools and customs, who are we to draw a line between human and not quite? We did not stand alone in the Ice Age. We stood among cousins, each different, each dreaming, each finding their own way through the white silence. And some of them, perhaps many, were more like us than we ever dared believe. Yet they vanished. By 30,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were gone. The Denisovans left behind only fragments, shadows in our genomes. What happened to them? The truth is we don't fully know. There was no single war, no final catastrophe. Instead there was drift, of time, of climate, of territory. Glaciers surged and retreated, forests swallowed grassland. And in these shifts some lifeways withered. Small populations became smaller. A bad winter, a failed birth, a disrupted migration, and a lineage can slip quietly from the world. But the story is not about triumph, it is about inheritance. Because we did not simply replace them, we carry them. And with that realization comes an unsettling beauty. The people we once imagined as other are already within us. Our hands, our brains, our immune systems, all shaped in part by the lives they lived. Their winters are our winters. Their stories, even if lost to sound, echo in our blood. The shape of your nose, the reaction of your skin to sunlight, the elevation you breathe best at. These may be Neanderthal or Denisovan gifts. They are not fossils. They are alive in us. This is not metaphor. This is molecular truth. DNA does not lie, and it does not discriminate. It carries what survives, quietly, without asking permission. The child playing in the mammoth steppe snow did not know which lineage she belonged to. The man who buried a friend in ochre and bone did not see himself as part of a species. These ideas, labels, categories, are ours, but they did not live in theories. They lived in the rhythm of breath, of step, of survival. They knew danger, love, hunger, wonder, in forms we would recognize. And perhaps that's the point, that humanity was never meant to be tidy, that our origins are not linear but layered, woven, braided. The more we uncover, the more humility is required, not just to adjust our science, but to expand our empathy, to look at a Neanderthal skull not as a relic of failure, but as a variation of brilliance, to imagine the Denisovan as more than a genetic curiosity, but as a child held in arms, a hunter on the trail, a singer beside firelight. And when we do this, when we allow for multiplicity, we don't weaken our story. We enrich it. We widen the circle of belonging. We begin to see that the past was not filled with failed experiments, but with diverse expressions of intelligence, courage, and care. Because being human was never about being alone. It was about being among others who thought, who built, who mourned, who loved. The story of our species is not the story of a ladder. It is the story of a forest, branching, intertwining, alive with parallel lives. And for a time, that forest was full. Neanderthals carved tools from flint and antler. Denisovans walked the high plateaus. Homo sapiens sang at the edge of ice. Perhaps we shared myths. Perhaps we feared each other. But we were there, together, under the same stars. Now, when we peer back through the tunnel of time, we find not just ourselves, but echoes. And some of those echoes are not faint. We see their hands in the soil, their teeth in the bones of hunted prey, their pigments smeared on limestone. We see their love in burials, their skill in weapons, their wisdom in survival. We may not know their languages, but their intentions cross time, and this recognition calls something forward in us, something ancient, something ethical. If we were once many kinds of humans, then the line between us and them grows porous, even fragile. It invites us to revisit how we define difference, not just in the past, but here, now. In a world fractured by imagined borders and rigid categories, the Ice Age offers an invitation to see complexity as kinship, not threat. Because perhaps the deepest legacy of Neanderthals and Denisovans is not biological but philosophical. They remind us that humanity was always plural, that survival did not belong to one shape of skull, one kind of tool, one colour of skin. It belonged to those who could adapt, who could share, who could learn, even across difference. Their absence is a silence, but within that silence is a kind of music, the harmonies of coexistence, the notes of contact, the rhythm of shared life. And we are the ones who remember the tune. When we walk the windswept plains of Central Asia, when we descend into a cave thick with breath and ash, when we touch the bones with careful fingers, we're not just discovering, we're reuniting. We're answering a call that began before memory and continues in marrow. Because in the end, the Ice Age was not an age of isolation. It was an age of meeting, of convergence, of other humans just like us and not like us, who made their lives meaningful in the same frost, under the same sun, with the same trembling hands. And in remembering them, we remember more of ourselves. It began with a silence more profound than death, a silence that stretched across continents, fell over forests, and turned the breath of animals into clouds that froze mid-air. This was not just winter. This was the last glacial maximum, a moment in Earth's long memory when the cold no longer came and went but settled like a verdict. The world was changing, not with fire, but with ice. Across the northern latitudes, glaciers unspooled their slow dominion. They crept over valleys, ground down mountains, swallowed entire ecosystems. Where once there had been rolling grasslands and herds of giant beasts, there was now only a grinding wall of white. What happens to memory when the land that once held it vanishes beneath a mile of ice? What happens to meaning when the rivers run dry, or change course entirely, not over centuries, but over seasons? The air grew colder, but the world did not grow quieter. Instead, it groaned. Forests dying, winds sharpening, animals retreating into narrower and narrower bands of survivable land. Megafauna that had ruled for tens of thousands of years began to fall. The woolly rhinoceros, the cave lion, the steppe bison, the great sloths. These creatures had adapted through glacial swings before, but this time the shift was too sudden, too fierce, and around them, human communities felt the pressure tighten. Where do you go when the earth itself becomes a labyrinth of hunger? They moved, they adapted, they built more robust shelters, refined their tools, followed the herds that still moved, though thinner, slower, wary. Fire was no longer just warmth. It was strategy. It was signalling. It was a shield. The Ice Age, once survivable through resilience alone, now demanded ingenuity. It was a test not only of endurance, but of imagination. And imagination did not freeze. In the wake of the great ecological collapse, stories changed. Myths darkened. The world was no longer a gift, but a riddle. Shapes in the ice became spirits. The vanishing of animals became omens. To understand cold was no longer only to survive it, it was to give it meaning. Why did the mammoths vanish? Why did the sun abandon its course? The answers could not be found in bone or blood alone. They had to be sung, remembered, ritualized. And yet, even ritual could not stop the shattering. Entire cultures were erased, languages unspoken, tools left in frozen soil where no hand would ever grip them again. The Ice Age was ending, but not with relief, with reckoning. What does it mean to live through the dying of worlds? It means learning that survival is not a guarantee, but a fragile agreement with the forces that shape the earth. and during the last great pulse of the Ice Age, that agreement was breaking down. At the heart of this upheaval stood the megafauna, vast, majestic creatures that once thundered across the tundra and steppe. Mammoths, ground sloths, woolly rhinoceroses, saber-toothed cats. They had weathered countless cold cycles before, but this time was different. The cold was not merely cold, it was erratic. Harsh freezes followed by unstable thaws. Ecosystems collapsing not gradually, but in cascades. The great beasts adapted to consistency, found their ancient rhythms betrayed. And humans? We were there too, watching the giants fall. What happens to the psyche of a people who witness the death of everything they once hunted, admired, feared? Some believe we played a role, that our spears, our coordination, our hunger helped drive them into oblivion. Others say the sky shifted too fast for any one species to be responsible. But perhaps both are true. Perhaps we were both witnesses and catalysts caught in the same storm. And as the beasts disappeared, so too did the stories that had grown up around them. Without mammoths, what becomes of the tales told in firelight? Without lions, what becomes of courage? The mythology of survival cracked beneath the weight of absence. And yet absence made something new. Faced with a world that no longer held the familiar, humans adapted again. Not just physically, but mentally, spiritually. They began to think differently about their place in the order of things. In burial sites dated to this period, we find bodies laid carefully, often with tools, ochre, antlers, as if in preparation for a journey beyond death. A kind of resilience took hold, but it was not merely practical, it was poetic. It was the invention of meaning against the void. What does it take to build meaning when the sky grows cruel and the land grows mute? In the teeth of the cold, humans began to carve not just for use but for memory. Small figurines, etched bones, beads, objects that served no survival function but carried something else, continuity, symbols, connection. They may have remembered the mammoths, they may have remembered the warmth, or they may have simply said, "We are still here." To endure is to resist forgetting, and in that resistance something quietly profound was taking shape. Not just a response to extinction, but the first drafts of identity written in the language of survival. But the forgetting had already begun. Entire species disappeared, not with spectacle, but with silence. Their bones remained, strewn across melt lakes, buried under ash, trapped in peat. And from those silent remains, a question rose like breath into cold air. What kind of world do you build when the old one no longer holds? Humans did not only mourn, they transformed. As environments collapsed, they began to shift everything. Their movements, their alliances, their beliefs. The last glacial maximum shattered not only the land, but the logic by which the land was known. Forest became tundra. Tundra became desert. Deserts flooded with sudden melt. Food patterns changed. Old migration paths vanished. In this swirling instability, survival no longer depended solely on strength, but on a new kind of intelligence as the ability to predict the unpredictable, to find structure in chaos, and in chaos myth is born. What happens to memory when there is no longer a place to return to? Crisis became the forge of story. Myths began to circulate, not simply of the cold, but of the fall, of golden animals retreating underground, of gods who once walked the earth but withdrew their favour. These were not escapist fictions, they were architectures of meaning. Blueprints for endurance. They mapped pain onto a canvas of cosmos. They explained why mothers wept and herds no longer came. In them, the natural world was not a machine to be decoded, but a living presence that could be offended, appeased, listened to. And amid the coldest centuries came perhaps the warmest fire of all, the deepening of human relationship. Communities shrank, but intimacy grew. What else could be done when the blizzard outside promised death? Shared breath, shared story, shared warmth. These became sacred. In small bands huddled in caves or behind windbreak walls of mammoth bone, new rituals arose. The painting of hands, the marking of stone, the telling of how things used to be, not for nostalgia but for survival of identity. Because what do you hold on to when everything else is stripped away? You hold to each other. You hold to memory. You hold to the idea that meaning is stronger than ice. And in this, the human story took on a new shape. Not a march forward, but a spiral of collapse and renewal, of endings that give birth to beginnings. The Ice Age was no longer just a backdrop for evolution. It had become a crucible for consciousness, and still the sky darkened. In some places temperatures plummeted further, winds sharpened, and snow became a permanent presence, reshaping not just the land but the soul. In other regions, unpredictable warming led to floods and chaos. The earth was in flux, and not just colder, but unstable, wounded, wild. Sea levels dropped by hundreds of feet, exposing vast new territories, yet even these apparent gifts came with consequences. A wider land bridge might promise migration, but migration without food meant exile without destination. Every movement was a gamble, and across this fractured world, cultures diverged, not in essence, but in strategy. Some sought shelter, burrowing deeper into caves, building walls of bone and hide to defy the wind. Others wandered, following game across collapsing corridors, learning the rhythms of survival, not from maps, but from the instincts of animals. Hunters became more precise, gatherers more observant. Every sign, a broken twig, a shift in the birds, a trail of scat, became scripture. And in this attention, in this reverence for pattern, a new way of knowing emerged. What is knowledge when the library is a storm? It is attentiveness. It is humility. It is a willingness to be wrong, to change course, to begin again with each sunrise. And it was not just the environment that was being rewritten. So too were the structures of society. The pressures of scarcity demanded cohesion, and those who could not cooperate fell away. Elders became more central, not as rulers, but as memory keepers. Children became sacred, their survival a symbol of future worth sacrificing for. And somewhere in the cold, love became sharper, not romantic idealism, but the kind of love that carries wood, that watches the fire, that gives food when there is not enough, and, still, the cold deepened, and still they endured. And in this endurance myths crystallized. There are stories from Arctic peoples even today, of great floods, of eternal winters, of sun spirits banished and then reborn. And though these stories were shaped over millennia, their seeds were planted here, in the time of great unravelling. Crisis did not merely break worlds, it birthed them. What happens when the stories you tell are not of victory, but of surviving the loss? A different kind of hero emerges, not the conqueror, but the rememberer. The one who carries the embers, not to burn, but to keep. The one who watches the stars through frost-lined eyes and wonders not how to dominate the world, but how to belong to it when it breaks. The Ice Age did not end with a single thaw. It ended with trembling, with fits and starts. A world waking from a dream it did not understand. Sea levels rose, slowly at first, then with greater speed. Rains returned, not gently but in torrents. Forests crept back across the steppes, but not where they had once stood. The very maps inside the human mind had to be redrawn. But what do you draw a map from when everything you knew has changed? You draw it from memory, from myth, from resilience. Some groups perished, lost to archaeology, their tools rusting into anonymity. Others moved and found new ways to live, near rivers now swollen with meltwater, in woodlands teeming with game. New materials emerged, antler, sinew, the first flints that would later become agriculture's tools. Adaptation became inheritance, but beneath every new footstep on warming ground was a footprint frozen in time, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been learned. Archaeologists today still find the evidence, bones stained with ochre, tools refined for climates long gone, dwellings built in impossible places. They read these remains not just as data points, but as voices, echoes of those who endured. And in each echo, a whisper, that life is not guaranteed, but gifted. That meaning is not found in dominion, but in relationship. The cold did not simply retreat, it left fingerprints. In our genomes, remnants of that age remain. adaptations for cold tolerance, dietary shifts, even psychological patterns honed in scarcity. And in our cultures, the stories of great floods, long winters, vanished beasts, they still echo. From the sagas of the Norse to the dreams of the Inuit, from the songs of the Sami to the carved memories in Alpine caves, the Ice Age never fully ended. It simply folded itself into us. So the viewer, the seeker, the one who walks among ruins not of stone but of memory, what lesson do they return with? That survival is not merely continuation, it is transformation. That what shatters does not always disappear. Sometimes it becomes the story. Sometimes it becomes you. What if the Earth could remember? Not just in rocks or fossils, not in the drifting arrangements of stars, but in something colder, more pristine, more exact. A memory that does not age, that does not embellish or forget. Buried beneath the silence of tundra and glacier, there is such a memory. And its name is ice. The permafrost is more than frozen ground. It is a vault, a crystalline library that holds not only the bones of mammoths and the teeth of wolves, but the very breath of extinct forests, the pollen of vanished summers, the genomes of lost peoples. For tens of thousands of years, snow has fallen and seasons have returned, and still the cold has kept its grip. In that grip, nothing decays. Bacteria sleep. Hair keeps its curl. DNA waits. What does it mean to open such a vault? In recent decades, scientists in the high north have begun doing just that, carving into ice cores drilled deep into Greenland and Siberia, uncovering layered histories that run backward through time. Each ring is a year, each fleck a moment. Trapped in bubbles smaller than seeds are the atmospheric whispers of ages past. Carbon levels, volcanic ash, cosmic dust. These are not just data points. They are frozen conversations between the earth and its sky, messages passed from age to age, unspoken until now. And then there are the bodies. The girl in the ice, the boy in the reindeer cloak, the woman buried in ochre. They appear not as bones, but as people. Their skin still holds the imprint of time. Their stomachs hold the seeds they last ate. Their blood, when coaxed from thawing veins, still carries the instructions of their ancestors. DNA spirals not shattered by time, but preserved by stillness. How many stories can be recovered from silence? Ancient DNA extraction is no longer a miracle, it is a method. From a single tooth, a hair shaft, even the preserved gut of a long-dead animal, scientists now read genetic sequences that reveal entire vanished populations. They tell of migrations never carved into stone, of family trees that twisted through Ice Age steppes. They show us that Homo sapiens did not walk alone, but braided with Neanderthals, Denisovans and others whose names we have not yet learned to pronounce. Each new genome is not just a discovery, but a reunion, the reappearance of someone thought gone, now speaking again in a molecular tongue. And the Earth remembers more than people. It remembers forests that no longer exist, spruce and pine stretching across what is now barren plain. It remembers summers that lasted only weeks and winters that never fully lifted. It remembers the breath of the aurochs, the footsteps of the cave lion, the weight of a glacier grinding stone into song. When scientists extract the microscopic traces left behind, a fleck of pollen, a grain of volcanic ash, they are not simply gathering facts. They are opening a time capsule sealed by silence, and in that silence the planet speaks. Ice cores drilled deep into the heart of Greenland and Antarctica are not just frozen water. They are layer upon layer of atmospheric memory, each capturing a whisper of what the sky once held. Trapped within them are ancient air bubbles, compressed remnants of winds that once swept across Mammoth Steppe and Glacial Ridge. Analysing the chemistry of these bubbles, their carbon, their methane, their isotopes of oxygen, reveals not only temperatures and climate swings, but fire, famine, and flood. They speak of eruptions that dimmed the sun, of sudden warmings that melted centuries in mere decades, of a world always on the edge of change, and the story deepens, because hidden in the same layers of permafrost are the footprints of culture, fibres from woven mats, strands of human hair, fragments of tools, pieces of charcoal from long-dead hearths. These too are archives. They show how people adapted, how they endured, how they told time without clocks and remembered without writing. In some layers, scientists have found soot from fires made over 20,000 years ago, carbon residue from the moment when someone somewhere knelt in the snow and sparked warmth into being. What were they thinking? Were they alone? This is not the memory of a historian. It is the memory of a planet, and like all memories, it is partial, selective, fragile. Permafrost can thaw, ice can melt, archives can be lost not only to time, but to us, to our warmth, to our haste, to our unknowing footsteps across ancient terrain. As the Arctic warms today faster than almost any region on Earth, this vast frozen memory is beginning to awaken. But awakening in this case means vanishing. The ice tells its story only once, and if we do not listen, it is gone. So what is our responsibility in the face of such fleeting clarity? What must it mean to live in an age when the past is melting? Not metaphorically, but literally. In the hollows of Siberian soil, researchers have uncovered forests entombed in frost. Tiny leaves, still green, sealed in time by sudden cold. In the veins of these forgotten birches and willows are the chemical signatures of air once breathed by mammoths and reindeer, and in the same layer of ice, scattered like punctuation marks in a frozen sentence, are the remains of insects, of fungal spores, of dust carried from deserts long turned to tundra. This is more than sediment. This is memory, delicate, absolute, unrepeatable. From these fragments, scientists build entire ecosystems, not with guesses, but with genomes. It is a science that blurs the line between reconstruction and resurrection. In laboratories around the world, the cold has become a teacher. Sequenced strands of ancient DNA are placed beside those of modern species, revealing lines of descent and divergence once invisible. Through these patterns, we begin to see with new eyes that woolly rhinos were not outliers, but cousins to creatures still among us, that vanished grasses once formed vast plains, pulsing with migration and bloom. And it is not only the organic that returns. Mineral signatures from ice cores tell us when oceans grew more acidic, when great fires swept continents, when the Earth's axis wobbled just enough to tilt the seasons toward ice or thaw. Paired with climate models, these insights let us time travel, not in fantasy, but in atmosphere. We can now predict not only the past, but its consequences, reading the Earth's rhythms like music etched into glacier glass. But in all this data, where is the human heartbeat? It is found in the overlap, the moment where a DNA sequence from a buried tooth matches the genome of a living person in Central Asia. The instant when a pollen grain from 27,000 years ago perfectly matches one found near a Neolithic hearth. These are not coincidences. They are threads in a vast, intricate web, a reminder that time does not vanish. It transforms. What if the Earth is not just a place we live upon? What if it is the storyteller and we are simply learning to listen? The idea changes everything, because stories, unlike measurements, are alive. They evolve, they respond, they carry intention. And when we begin to see the ice not merely as frozen water, but as a narrative medium, as parchment laid down one snowflake at a time, we must also accept our role as readers and as editors. Our choices now will determine which pages remain legible and which melt into silence. This is the ethical weight of memory. Paleoclimatologists and geneticists are increasingly aware that their work is not isolated from urgency. As they peer into cores and calibrate ancient genomes, they are also racing the clock. Permafrost, once thought eternal, is thawing, not slowly, but catastrophically. Villages sink, roads buckle, ancient graves weep open. Some samples now come not from careful excavations, but from landslides, where entire stories slough off the earth in a single warm afternoon. It is no longer science as curiosity. It is science as salvage. Yet even here, there is a kind of reverence. When researchers in the Canadian Arctic extracted DNA from a wolf pup frozen for over 50,000 years, they did not merely study her, they named her Jour. They preserved her eyelids, her whiskers, her fur still fluffed from the last breath she took. And in doing so, they affirmed something ancient, that memory is not a specimen, but a relationship. What do you owe to a past that remembers you? This is the quiet question behind the frozen archive. We do not merely look back, we are looked back upon. The DNA we extract is also watching us. The pollen, the ash, the tools in the thawing soil. They are not passive, they are communicative. They remind us that the earth is not a backdrop but a witness, and that witness now speaks in warnings. In the same ice cores that tell us of mammoths and fire, we now see our own breath. Carbon dioxide levels higher than any in hundreds of thousands of years. The archive has flipped. We are no longer just reading history, we are writing it. The top layers of ice contain our story now, our choices, our emissions, our imprint. What will the next readers find? Will they see our time as a turning point, a chapter where we paused, listened, and began to act with the long view in mind? Or will our layer in the ice be thin, strange, marked with plastic particles, combustion soot, and silence? The memory of ice is not just ancient, it is intimate. It reminds us that what seems ephemeral, a snowfall, a breath, a footstep, can be preserved for tens of thousands of years. That preservation is not about importance, but conditions. That the most delicate things, a strand of hair, a pollen grain, the echo of a forest, can last longer than cities, longer than empires, if only the cold holds. And in that truth is a kind of hope. If memory can survive like this, so too can meaning. Across museums and labs, the frozen are being ready to speak again. Not as curiosities, but as voices in a human chorus stretching across time. Their DNA is helping revive ancestral plants. Their isotopes are guiding models of future drought. Their stomach contents hint at diets that once sustained us in balance. The past is no longer remote. It is data. It is direction. And more than that, it is kin. To know this is to understand the Earth not as inert matter, but as a participant in memory-making, a co-author of our story. The glaciers write in layers, the tundra stores what we discard, the wind folds whispers into snow. In this worldview, our relationship with the past shifts. We are not at the end of the story, but in its middle, shaped by what came before, responsible for what comes next. When we walk upon ice, we walk upon memory. When we melt it, we release not only water, but wisdom. The memory of ice teaches restraint. It shows us the speed of ecosystems, the rhythms of climate, the patience of evolution. It reminds us that time is not ours alone, and that knowledge left unheeded is knowledge lost. The earth has written us letters in snowflakes and sediment, in mammoth sinew and glacial ash. They are waiting to be read, and so the viewer, you, return from this chapter not with answers, but with questions that hum beneath your skin. What traces will I leave behind? What breath of mine might remain in air centuries from now? What story, frozen or not, do I wish to tell? The cold remembers. Will we? There is a moment, quiet but staggering, when the face of someone who died 40,000 years ago is reconstructed, and they look back at us, not in metaphor, not through myth, but with eyes shaped by bone and brow, lips softened by forensic clay, and skin tinted by the melanin their genes once coded. The ancient becomes intimate. We do not imagine them, we recognize them. A tilt of the chin like a cousin's, a wide-set gaze that stirs something ancestral in the gut. What happens when we stare into the mirror of time, and the reflection does not belong to kings or myths, but to people who once crouched beside a fire and watched the sky deepen into frost? Scientists call it facial approximation, but it is closer to resurrection. With ancient DNA as a scaffold, forensic anthropologists trace the contours of cheekbones once buried beneath permafrost. They cross-reference genomes with populations alive today, mapping inherited traits with uncanny precision. Skin tone, hair curl, eye colour, even predispositions to freckling or facial asymmetry. From fragments of skull and sequences of code, a face reappears, not in profile, not as a statue, but as someone who might step onto a train, someone we would not look twice at in a crowd. But we do look twice, because in that face something ancient stirs, not just recognition, but responsibility. If they are like us, then their world was not alien. It was ours. Colder perhaps, wilder, but filled with the same soft terrors and quiet joys that thread our own lives. And if we resemble them, then their stories too belong to us. What emotions did they carry in those eyes? This is where the science of appearance folds into the philosophy of empathy. A reconstruction is not a photograph. It is an act of interpretation, of storytelling. But within its limits lies a profound opportunity to ask whether fear, hope, grief, and tenderness were shaped into their faces the way they are into ours. And the answer, again and again, is yes. From burials, we recover the curled posture of mothers holding children. From paintings, we read gestures that mean memory, longing, or awe. Even the injuries etched into their bones, healed fractures, missing fingers, blunt trauma, hint at stories that echo our own. They were not waiting to evolve into us. They were already complete. If we stare long enough, do we begin to see ourselves not as endpoints, but as continuations? Because to look into the face of an Ice Age woman, reconstructed not in marble, but in careful tissue layers over bone, guided by the double helix still spiralling through her ancient cells, is to face the discomforting beauty of continuity. Her brow is not foreign, her jawline not archaic. In the curve of her mouth, there is something familiar, something unfinished. Can resemblance bridge 40,000 years? What we now understand is that emotions are not modern inventions. They did not arrive with writing or with temples. They are older than civilization, older even than agriculture. They bloomed in the Ice Age, in the fireside gazes and forested silences of people whose lives left no monuments, but whose feelings were carved in gesture, in rhythm, in the unspoken synchrony of group survival. The nervous smile of a child, the tightening of the eyes in grief, the quiet intimacy of shared food. These things existed when mammoths still roamed. From grave sites in the Dolny Vestonis basin to the icy burial chambers of Siberia, we uncover not just bodies but patterns, beads placed in careful arrangements, ochre sprinkled in spirals, antlers bent and pressed into hands long gone cold. These were not random acts, they were rites, and rites speak of memory, of love, of farewell. What does it mean that we mourned before we ever wrote? It means that our ancestors were not primitives clawing through frost, but human beings capable of metaphor, capable of understanding that a death was not an ending but a transition, capable of symbol, of carrying the meaning of a person in an object, in a gesture, in a story. Their rituals were not guesses. They were conversations with the unknown. And in every culture that followed, echoes of those first questions remain. Where does the soul go? Does it freeze, or does it fly? We are only beginning to understand how profound the similarities are. Neuroscientists now speculate that the basic emotional architecture of the human brain, the pathways for fear, joy, attachment, and grief, has changed very little in tens of thousands of years, which means that when a parent buried a child in a cave 30,000 years ago, the pain was not symbolic. It was real. The absence was just as piercing, the quiet just as unbearable. How do you grieve across epochs? Only by recognizing that they grieve too. And once that truth is known, not guessed, not imagined, but confirmed by stone, pigment, and gene, something quiet begins to unfold inside the viewer. The Ice Age no longer lives in black and white sketches of cavemen or in the shadowy recesses of museums. It lives here, behind the eyes. It lives in the blood's memory. It lives in the uncanny way a mother cradles a child today with the same instinct as one who lived beside reindeer herds when Europe was a frozen steppe. If their emotions endure in us, what else might? Some scientists call it deep structure, the idea that certain behaviours, gestures and intuitions are not taught but remembered. An infant's cry, a gaze that seeks a face, a song hummed to no one in particular. These may not be modern comforts but Ice Age inheritances. Behaviours tested against millennia of winter and dark, refined not in years but in ages. What does it mean to carry so much time in the way we love? This is where the mirror becomes less a surface and more a passage. A portal not to the past but to continuity. The person we see in the reconstructions, with skin as real as yours, with eyelashes and a soft chin, is not a relic. They are a fellow traveller. What divides us from them is not evolution but context. The ice has melted, the predators changed, but the inner weather, the storm of emotion, the longing for meaning is constant. Their stories echo through us. And in a world increasingly obsessed with novelty, it is the ancient that now feels revolutionary. To see ourselves not as postmodern anomalies, but as the latest iteration of a long, enduring human pattern, this is grounding. The myths of separation fall away. The fiction of progress as distance from nature or from the primitive collapses. We are not separate. We are suspended in the same arc, just further along the spiral. So when a child's face is reconstructed from Ice Age remains, her features tender, her expression resting in calm, we do not just see her, we remember her. Somewhere in the bone, in the wet circuitry of the brain, we know her, because we have been her, because we are her. And what if the Ice Age never truly ended? What if it only transformed, moved beneath the surface, not just geologically, but emotionally? Because within us, the Ice Age lingers, not only in our DNA, where tiny genetic whispers tell of those who weathered glaciers, hunted across wind-blasted tundras, and sang under cold stars, but in the very way we sense danger, gather warmth, and yearn for light in long darkness. The Ice Age is not a period sealed off in time. It is a season still breathing through our instincts. This realization unfolds slowly. It is not taught in textbooks, nor revealed in timelines. It is felt, in the silence of a snowfall, in the firelight of stories told around kitchen tables, in the body's involuntary shiver when the air turns cold. We are not divorced from that ancient world. We are its dream continuing. Even our languages remember. The oldest words in proto-languages, fire, mother, cold, stone, are not abstractions. They are relics of survival, passed down not through scripture but through need, words as shelters, sounds as tools. The people who spoke them were shaping not only sentences but futures. They were inventing memory, and memory would become civilization. And still, the face, the reconstructed gaze that meets our own across tens of millennia is not a challenge. It is an offering, a mirror not held in vanity but in recognition. It says, you come from endurance. You are the descendant of those who survived ice, silence, and loss. Not because they were the strongest, but because they shared warmth, because they imagined futures. Imagination, after all, is the most human of survival tools. We do not find tools of war in every site, but we do find carvings, pendants, footprints of children beside fire pits, hands traced in ochre. To press one's palm against a cave wall was to say, I was here, I mattered, you too will matter. This impulse, to create meaning, to outlast death through symbol, is not modern, it is glacial. What happens when we accept that our ancestors were artists before they were farmers? We see them not as preludes, but as peers. Their world was not static or ignorant. It was dynamic, creative, mythic. To reconstruct their faces is not enough. We must reconstruct their dignity. Because every burial, every pigment, every tool etched with care suggests the same truth. They were not waiting for us. They were already alive. What stories were told when the stars hung closer? What names were whispered into wool-lined cradles? These are not idle questions. They are invitations to remember that history is not a ladder we climb, but a circle we inhabit. And the Ice Age, far from a remote and savage epoch, becomes a whisper beneath our skin, a rhythm in the way we fear, create, and endure. Every flake of preserved skin, every ancient tooth, every strand of resurrected DNA, folds back into the question that has haunted us since we first traced symbols on stone. Who were we before we forgot? Facial reconstruction is not vanity, it is revelation. It is the sudden breath of warm wind in a frozen cave, the moment when theory becomes intimacy. To see their faces is to break the fourth wall of time. And what we find, again and again, is not monstrous, not exotic, but heartbreakingly familiar. These were not beings to be classified. They were people to be remembered. In the soft downturn of a reconstructed eye, in the shy tension of a jaw, in the geometry of a brow that once furrowed in thought, There we are. Not only in form, but in fragility. The face is a time machine not because it changes, but because it doesn't. Our bodies have changed little since those days, but our stories have scattered. Yet the face gathers them again, a map written in the quiet language of resemblance. And perhaps that is the final revelation. Not that we are descended from them, but that we still are them. Every survival instinct, every act of art, every moment of laughter in winter or love beside firelight is not a new invention, but an echo, a repetition in a longer melody. The Ice Age did not vanish. It transformed into architecture, into myth, into the quiet spaces between our thoughts. How much of who we are has been shaped not by civilization, but by endurance? And how much of what we fear, the cold, the dark, the hunger for meaning, is not modern anxiety but ancestral memory? If the mirror does not lie, then neither does this truth. The past is not past. It is prologue, and the human face, whether painted in ochre or scanned in a lab, still speaks the same language, a language of survival, of wonder, of belonging. So the next time you see a reconstruction, a girl whose eyes last opened 40,000 years ago, whose cheekbones still remember wind and laughter, do not look away. Look closer, because she is not behind you. She is beside you. It did not happen all at once. The ice, which had sculpted continents and carved valleys, began its retreat not with a roar, but with a long exhale. Slowly, imperceptibly, glaciers that had towered over the northern world started to melt. The colossal silence of frozen time gave way to the hush of running water. And in that thaw, in the first glimmering pools beneath the ancient white, life stirred differently. Not in desperation this time, but in readiness. The earth was waking from its long sleep. How does a species remember warmth after generations of cold? This was the first challenge of the new world, not how to survive winter, but how to live in spring. For tens of thousands of years, humanity had known only hunger and frostbite, only migration and fear. And yet, within us, the thaw was also taking root. As ice retreated across Eurasia, vast green corridors opened. Rivers swelled and flowed across fresh valleys. Herds followed these new paths, and with them, people. The Great Migration resumed, not as an escape, but as an expansion. They moved not because they were driven, but because they could. What does it mean when the world becomes possible again? From the Caucasus to the British Isles, from the Siberian plains to the warming spine of Scandinavia, humans carried with them not just tools and skins, but stories. They carried echoes of a world where the stars had guided hunters across snow-choked passes, where fire was not a convenience but a covenant. Now they brought those ancient truths into a land transformed. They did not abandon the past. They wore it like a second skin, braided into new myths, adapted to new soils. And in that spreading, something miraculous began to happen. Cultures blossomed. No longer pressed against extinction, these descendants of the ice made space for expression, carving, painting, singing, burying, building. Where once a hearth was just warmth, now it became the centre of memory. Where once a tool was made to kill, now it was shaped to last. Every step across the receding snow was a step toward meaning. The act of walking became sacred again. And the world, still raw and volatile in its youth, offered humanity a second canvas. Who were we becoming, now that we were no longer merely surviving? With every passing season, this question deepened. The evidence is written in the layers, in the charred grains found in clay pots, in the pollen trapped beneath the sediment of once frozen lakes. It is etched in the genetics of wild plants slowly coaxed toward domestication, in the bones of wolves drawn to the scent of cooking fires, tamed not through force but through coexistence. Civilization, if it was beginning, did not erupt. It rippled, quietly, patiently, across the warming earth. And in that slow unravelling of cold came the first roots of permanence. Where once people wandered according to the breath of beasts and the whisper of seasons, they now lingered. In the fertile crescent of what we would come to call Mesopotamia, in river valleys softened by meltwater, seeds were pressed into soil. Not just literal seeds, but cultural ones. Memory, once scattered like footprints on a windswept plain, began to take root in place. Humans became cultivators not only of plants, but of memory itself. But was it truly a choice? Or was it an inevitability, whispered by the land itself? When the mammoth herds thinned and the reindeer withdrew, people stayed behind. They learned that barley could be guided, wheat persuaded. They bent the wild to the arc of intention. Fire, once carried from ember to ember across miles of migration, now lived in hearths that knew the names of children. And those children, in turn, became stewards of story. But even as the plough replaced the spear, the Ice Age left its fingerprint. Domestication did not erase the nomad, it transformed them. Villages emerged where campfires once flickered, but within those walls lived the echoes of the hunt, in ritual, in song, in the quiet reverence for what could not be controlled. Agriculture brought food, but it also brought memory. The rhythm of planting and harvest mimicked the ancient cycles of scarcity and feast. We were not reinventing the world, we were sculpting it in the likeness of the old one. Was this the true legacy of the cold? Not suffering, but shape. The line between survival and civilization is thinner than we imagine. In the tools of early farmers, polished axes, sun-aligned granaries, grain stored against the unknown, we see not progress alone, but remembrance. To tame land was to confront death with continuity. To store grain was to defy winter's silence with a promise. We will return. And in the dust of ancient floors, in the wear patterns of stone thresholds, archaeologists find not just remnants of survival, but signs of rhythm, of habit, of repetition. Civilization did not bloom in a vacuum. It emerged like a spring-fed stream, its headwaters deep in the glacial past. Every seed pressed into earth was also pressed into story, and story, more than anything, is what made us. But what happens when the past is no longer a place we escape, but a place we carry? The people of the post-glacial world carried with them the Ice Age not as a curse, but as a lesson. They remembered what it meant to lose everything. They remembered what it meant to endure, and that memory, braided into their rituals, their myths and their technologies, became a compass, pointing not to the heavens, but inward toward resilience. But how do you build a future on the bones of extinction? The world they now inhabited was not the one their ancestors had known. The Ice Age had ended not with a single melting, but with a cascade of transformations, ecosystems collapsing, rivers redrawing the land, species disappearing into silence. The great mammoths had begun to vanish, their shadows dissolving into the warming mist, and with them went the way of life that had once felt eternal. Yet instead of collapsing, these new humans adapted. They did not merely mourn the past, they reimagined it. In that act of reinvention, warmth was not only a physical state, it became a metaphor. To be warm was to be rooted, to share, to settle. Fire, once a solitary defence against the dark, now flickered within communal hearths. The telling of stories shifted from tales of immediate survival to the shaping of collective identity. Where once a cave wall held the handprints of a fleeting tribe, now temples rose, aligned to solstices, testifying to an awareness that memory could outlast, the body. And with this warmth came complexity. Farming, for all its abundance, was not without consequence. The land, once seen as a living rhythm to follow, was now seen as something to be reshaped, owned, divided. The seeds planted in fertile soil were also seeds of hierarchy, of labour, of permanence. Yet even this too was an echo of Ice Age knowledge. For what is farming if not a domestication of time itself? To coax food from earth is to trust tomorrow. It is to bet on continuity. Did they know they were changing the arc of history? We do not know if the first farmers saw themselves as innovators. Likely, they did not. More likely, they saw themselves as children of the cold, simply doing what must be done to carry forward the old songs in a new key. The migration from ice to warmth was not linear. It pulsed in cycles of doubt and hope. But it was unrelenting, and in its rhythm something strange began to unfold. The emergence of culture not as reaction, but as design. What kind of wisdom is born when hardship gives way to abundance? This is the paradox of the post-Ice Age world. With every gain came a new fragility. Communities grew, but so did boundaries. Surplus created feasts, but also theft. Warmth birthed safety, but also war. Still, Beneath these new tensions flowed the same ancient current, the human desire to remember, to belong, to outlast the cold even as it faded from the land. How does a species learn to carry its wounds as wisdom? The answer lies not only in tools or temples, but in the whispered songs passed down from mother to child, in the shapes carved into wood and bone, in the seasonal festivals aligned not to the sun alone, but to the deep inherited feeling that something once hunted us in the dark. That some threat, vague, nameless, eternal, still lingered just beyond the firelight. Even in the warmth we kept the cold alive in myth. In one valley, a stone figurine was buried with careful offerings. Perhaps a goddess, perhaps a memory of a woman who once led the tribe through famine. In another, a circle of stones marked the passing of the solstice, a calendar not of commerce, but of reverence. The world was changing, but we did not let go of what had shaped us. We wove it into everything. Why do we still fear winter, even when it no longer rules? Because the Ice Age carved its lessons into the spine of our species. It taught us that survival is not a given, that warmth is borrowed, not guaranteed. So we built walls, but also stories. We invented gods, but also granaries. We learned to plant wheat, but never stopped watching the horizon for the long shadow of snow. And slowly humanity spread, not as a tide, but as a mosaic. Across Europe, Asia, and into the newly accessible Americas, people moved with the rivers and across plains once buried beneath ice. They carried with them not just genes and grain, but a sensibility, a way of reading the world that had been shaped by 100,000 years of hardship. They saw patterns in stars because they had lived under skies where nothing else marked the passage of time. They traced meaning in animal migrations because their lives had once depended on following hooves through blizzards. They read omens in clouds and cracks in stone because once, long ago, the earth itself had cracked beneath glaciers. What does it mean to carry a world that no longer exists? Perhaps it means that civilization was never a break from prehistory, but its natural bloom. Not a rejection of the wild, but its flowering in a different form. Warmth did not erase the human spirit shaped by cold. It simply offered a new canvas. And upon it, we painted what we remembered, not perfectly, not always kindly, but with urgency. The memory of cold did not fade, it fermented. It became the root of philosophy, of law, of ritual. It whispered, build something that will last this time, and so they did. What emerged in the wake of the glaciers was not just settlement, but civilization. The first cities rose like stone echoes of the temporary Ice Age camps. Only now the fire was permanent. The walls were shared, and the stories, once drawn in charcoal on limestone, now etched themselves into clay tablets and oral lineages that would span continents. Humans became more than survivors. They became archivists of their own existence. But did they forget the cold? Not entirely. Across every ancient civilization, from the river valleys of Mesopotamia to the floodplains of the Indus and the terraces of Mesoamerica, one finds remnants of awe, not just toward the sun, but toward the balance between warmth and the cold it once banished. The duality persisted. Gods were created to govern the seasons, festivals marked the solstices, and every winter's return was treated not with arrogance, but with ritual. Is this what it means to carry knowledge as legacy? The return of warmth was not a happy ending. It was a threshold, a turning of the page that revealed a new chapter, written with the ink of old memory. And in that memory, one truth burned brighter than all others, that humans are not invincible. They are attentive. They learn. They endure not through dominion over nature, but through reverence of it. So even as crops grew and trade routes expanded, the stories remained. The myth of the frozen time, of the beast that once ruled the earth, of the ancestors who walked with nothing but a flint blade and a vision, became the sacred background of every firelit tale. Children born into warmth were still raised on songs about the ones who came before, the ones who crossed ice bridges, who hunted mammoth, who dreamed in caves. The Ice Age became more than history. It became identity. And in the quiet between seasons, that identity whispered again, remember. Because beneath the roads and buildings and systems we now call civilization, the Ice Age still waits. Not as threat, but as teacher. Its wisdom is not in the frost, but in what the frost revealed, that humanity's true warmth is found not only in fire or sun, but in the decision to keep going, to keep shaping meaning from stone, soil, and silence. So what was the return of warmth? Not merely climate change, not merely a thawing. It was a moment when the human story stretched its limbs and stood fully upright, bearing the invisible inheritance of cold in its breath. A species now unbound by the glacier's edge, but never unmarked by it. The frost receded, but we never truly left it behind. The child is still there, wrapped in a silence older than nations, tucked into the folds of frozen earth that once swallowed her breath, but never let go of her story. We return to her now, not as archaeologists or observers, but as witnesses. When we first met her, she was a mystery in ice. Now she is a mirror. Her tiny limbs, curled in repose beneath layers of silt and time, are no longer just evidence. They are testimony, not of death, but of continuity. What do we see differently now that we've walked the world that shaped her? When her body was first lifted from the permafrost, it was the preservation that stole our breath. The perfection of her skin, the undisturbed quiet of her face, the impression that she might stir if only the light grew warmer. But today, with the weight of our journey behind us, we know that what was preserved wasn't simply flesh. It was a voice. And like all whispers from the past, it waited patiently for us to learn how to listen. Does time remember what we forget? In the stillness surrounding her remains, we now hear echoes of migration songs carried across wind-blasted steppes, the lullabies of mothers wrapped in furs beside flickering fires, the cautious hush of footsteps pressed into snow by hunters moving as shadows. She is no longer alone, her death no longer isolated. Her life is stitched into a broader tapestry of kin, Neanderthals, Denisovans, mammoth riders and spirit makers, each thread woven into us. How do we hold sacred what we cannot see? Around her lay objects once mistaken for ritual debris, now recognized as offerings. A carved fragment of antler, worn smooth by touch. A shell strung on sinew, likely carried for miles before finding rest beside her cheek. These were not scientific curiosities. They were gestures of love, acts of farewell, proof that memory itself had already begun to resist the pull of oblivion. In these quiet burials we glimpse the beginning of meaning, not imposed by language but breathed into matter. What endures when breath is gone? The frozen child is not the end of a story. She's a pause, a held breath in a symphony still unfolding. She reminds us that the Ice Age did not bury its people under indifference. It cradled them, preserved them, offered their stories not to the void, but to us. And we, the inheritors of this slow miracle, must now ask, will we listen? Because if we do, if we truly listen, we begin to understand that preservation is not an accident of climate, but an act of continuity. Permafrost does not merely pause decay, it protects context. Locked in its frost are not just remains, but relationships, between plants and animals, between hunger and ritual, between death and what follows. Each frozen body, each glinting tool, each clump of mammoth hair or undigested seed is part of a breath that was never truly exhaled. What happens when we breathe it in? Modern science has made the impossible audible. Genomics resurrects voices long silenced. Ice cores speak in layers of dust and trapped air, recounting volcanic winters and warming shifts. Microscopes pierce the glacial opacity to find pollen grains that bloomed for only a single season, yet left a legacy legible 40,000 years later. Time itself begins to feel less like a river and more like a spiral, and the child, silent in her icy shroud, becomes a node where many stories converge. Is this what memory looks like? Not linear, but layered? We peer into her cells, her isotopes, her mitochondrial trails, and we find that her story was never singular. She carried echoes of migrations from deeper pasts. Her genes whispered of Neanderthal grandmothers and Denisovan cousins. Her diet told of seasonal abundance and scarcity, of community cooking and foraging patterns shaped by both ecology and culture. Her death may have come swiftly, but her life was a mosaic, and that mosaic included us. How can something so ancient feel so close? The further back we look, the clearer our reflection becomes. In her we recognise the universal architecture of loss, the tiny body carefully wrapped, the objects chosen with care, the place selected for stillness. We recognise grief not as a modern phenomenon, but as an inheritance. Perhaps the oldest one. And if grief persists, then so too does love. For who would bury the dead with such care unless love lingered, even after breath had gone? What is love if not defiance against forgetting? And perhaps that is the final lesson of the frost, that to endure is not just to survive, but to remember. That each generation, warm or cold, builds itself upon the bones of those who came before, not to erase them, but to carry them forward. The child, then, is not gone. She is held, not by ice, but by us, not as artifact, but as ancestor. And so we find ourselves circling back to where this journey began, not at the edge of a scientific marvel, but at the threshold of something older, quieter, and more enduring. A return not only to a place, but to a question. What does it mean to belong to time? To be remembered not as a name, but as a presence, suspended in Earth's breathless memory. The permafrost, we now understand, is not a grave. It is a library. And this child, like so many others caught in the frost's slow exhale, is a volume still being read. Is it possible that the Earth keeps better records than we do? Her DNA, her bones, her burial, they are data, yes, but they are also stories. The distinction was never absolute. The soil around her feet tells of lichen that fed the deer her people followed. The spores beneath her ribcage remember the last meal she swallowed, maybe nuts, maybe berries, maybe something cooked with care by a mother who believed the next morning would come. These are not mere fragments. They are punctuation in a sentence that hasn't ended. The Ice Age spoke through the cold, and we, the warm-blooded inheritors, are only now learning to translate. How much of history lives in silence? We have wandered through the chapters of this frozen world, through the fires and tools, the mammoths and migrations, the extinctions and epiphanies, and all the while the frost has whispered, not loudly, not urgently, just enough to remind us that everything we take for granted, language, love, death, shelter, has roots so deep they touch the marrow of our shared becoming. Beneath each artifact lies an intention. Beneath each intention, a longing to endure, to be seen, to be known. What is survival if not a form of storytelling? Even now, with glaciers in retreat and satellites overhead, we remain shaped by cold. Our skin, our sleep, our metabolism remember the seasons of scarcity. Our stories, of darkness, of rebirth, of monsters in the snow, carry the spiritual residue of nights when fire meant everything, and our minds, wired to recognize faces, find kinship in the eyes of reconstructed ancestors whose bones we thought mute. We see ourselves. We feel, against all logic, that they see us too. Are we not then the continuation of their breath? And so the journey becomes a circle. The child, once a riddle, now stands as a beacon. She has changed us, not by speaking, but by waiting. Not by surviving, but by being held in a world that allowed her memory to remain intact. We leave her not behind, but within. Somewhere in our bones we carry her winter, not just the cold of survival, but the stillness of reverence. There is a quiet that settles over those who have stood before her, archaeologist or wanderer alike. Not a hush of reverent curiosity, but a stillness born from recognition. As if, in some inexpressible way, we already knew her. Not her story, not her name, but her shape in the world, the mark her absence leaves in the breath between moments. She is no longer merely a figure of science. She becomes an ancestor of the soul. What does it mean to belong to the dead, as much as to the living? To look into her hollowed eyes and see no fear, only the echo of time. To witness the threads of a lineage drawn not through kings and empires, but through the hearths of small families whose names are lost, but whose warmth we still carry in our skin. In the layered pollen around her grave, we find the traces of spring that followed, of life continuing as it always has, gently but persistently across the veil of grief. She becomes not a symbol of loss, but of return. Why do we mourn what still speaks? In the rituals of burial we glimpse the earliest gestures of faith, not in gods, necessarily, but in memory itself, a belief that something must endure. The careful placement of a body in the earth, the smudge of red ochre across bone, the position of hands, these were not random acts. They were declarations, that even in cold there is continuity, even in silence, meaning. Her community may have wept, or perhaps they sat in watchful quiet, listening to wind and ancestors alike. Either way, they did not forget. Can we say the same? In the museums where her image is projected and her genes sequenced, we find ourselves playing a new kind of ritual. Less sacred, perhaps, but still heavy with intention. We seek not to possess her story, but to be possessed by it, to let it settle into our view of the world, reshaping our certainty with awe. The Ice Age does not end with melting. It ends with memory, with the strange, delicate burden of knowing that who we were still lives beneath the frost, waiting to be heard. And if the Earth is our great archive, then each discovery is a page turned, each preserved child, mammoth, hunter, or flower. A paragraph in the story of us. And like all great stories, it resists conclusion. It loops, it folds, it returns. We are never finished, only further along. And now, standing again before the frozen child, the one who began this journey and now ends it, we no longer see a relic. We see a mirror, not polished, not perfect, but true. Her stillness is no longer alien. It is familial. She's no longer unknown. She is known in the quiet way trees know the wind, without words, without motion, but entirely. Her presence asks nothing of us but honesty. Honesty about where we came from and what we carry forward. What does it mean to be shaped by silence? The great warmth that followed her age did not erase her world. It only buried it deeper in the memory of Earth, in the melt of glaciers, in the pulse of rivers, in the stories whispered by firelight she continues, not as a body but as a breath, the breath beneath the frost. Every ending we encounter in this tale was a transformation, not a disappearance. The dead are not gone. They are woven into the land, into the wind, into us. Can you feel her watching through your eyes? The cycle does not close. It widens. The knowledge we've unearthed does not enshrine the past. It awakens the present. To understand these people is not simply to remember them. It is to feel responsible to them. To be modern is not to be separate. It is to be standing, trembling, at the edge of a vast inheritance, unsure whether we are worthy stewards of what we've been given. And what have we been given? The fire in bone, the shape of a handprint on stone, the ache of farewell carried across millennia like pollen in a drifting wind. 1,000 names will never speak of 1,000 tools worn smooth by unknown fingers, 1,000 glances across tundra skies. Gone, yes, but not lost. We are their children not only in blood but in wonder, in our desire to look backward not with conquest, but with awe, to listen, truly listen, for the voices in the ice. What do they whisper? That even in the harshest cold there was warmth, not of temperature, but of meaning. That death is not the enemy of life, but its most careful teacher. That to preserve something is not to stop time, but to invite it to flow through different channels. That we are not separate from the Ice Age. We are its final breath, its lingering echo, its question left unanswered, and perhaps its answer. And as we step away, leaving behind the snow-draped quiet of her resting place, we take with us not just facts, or artifacts, or DNA. We take the burden and the blessing of memory. We take the silence, and we listen. Because the frost is not an ending. It is a voice. It is a breath. And we are the ones who finally heard it. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for walking this long road through the ice with me, for following the breath beneath the frost and listening for the voices that waited quietly to be heard. If this story helped you feel wonder, or focus, or even just a small warmth in the deep stillness of time, I'm grateful you spent this time here, present, open, and listening. I wonder what image stayed with you most clearly. Was it the first glimpse of the frozen child's face, a handprint on a cave wall, or simply the hush of snow falling on a world not yet named? Whether it was the flicker of firelight caught in ancient eyes, the hush of a glacier breathing beneath our feet, or the moment we realized we carry their stories in our bones, these fragments connect us, silently weaving memory into meaning. If one moment lingered with you, I'd love to hear it, not as noise, but as a quiet offering to the circle we're building here. Your reflection is part of what makes this story live on. And if this kind of slow, thoughtful journey speaks to you, you might consider subscribing. We have more paths ahead, more ancient truths to uncover, and more questions waiting in the dark. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful.